Wait, that's Camille. What is she doing up there?
Broderick, what does that sign say?
$500 million.
She knew. This whole time she knew.
The sound of crystal was the first thing she would remember. Crystal touching crystal in the grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel in Atlanta. That high, ringing note. Clean and celebratory, and entirely indifferent to everything happening inside her chest. Camille Eugenia Graves had been listening to that sound for 2 hours and 37 minutes. She knew the exact time because she had been checking the small gold watch on her left wrist every 20 minutes since she arrived. Not because she was anxious, because she had learned in 5 years of these galas that the only way to survive them was to know exactly how much of the evening remained. She was 8 months pregnant. Her daughter had shifted position somewhere around 9:15 and had not shifted back. The pressure was low and heavy and insistent. A reminder, as if she needed one, that her body was doing something extraordinary even while she stood in a room full of people watching her husband be celebrated. Her gown was deep burgundy. She had it altered twice as the pregnancy moved forward. The seams were perfect now. The fabric moved with her. She knew without asking that she was the most composed woman in this room. She always was. She had learned composure the way other people learn languages, through necessity and repetition and the understanding that it was the one tool no one could take from her. This was Broderick's Gala, the Graves Capital annual gathering, the event that existed to remind every black business owner and investor in the southeastern United States who Broderick Kingston Graves was and what they owed him. Camille had attended every one of these galas since they married 5 years ago. She had smiled at every person in this room. She had learned their children's names. She remembered their anniversaries. She sent the right cards at the right times. She had never once made herself the center of a single conversation that was supposed to be about her husband's empire. She was excellent at disappearing inside a room while being fully visible. She learned it at Howard University. She perfected it in 5 years of this marriage. Camille excused herself from a conversation with the wife of one of Broderick's board members, a woman named Patricia, who had always been kind in the specific way of someone who suspects something and is relieved not to have to name it. Camille thanked her for the conversation. She turned and walked toward the hallway that led to the powder room. Her heels clicked softly on the marble. She was almost there when she heard it, a voice she recognized. Shanice Fontaine was standing in the alcove beside the coat check. She was turned away from the main hall. She was speaking on her phone in the low and certain tone of someone who does not expect to be overheard. "I am not worried," Shanice said. "She is 8 months pregnant, and she does not have a single asset in her own name." Camille stopped walking. "He told me himself," Shanice continued. "The only thing she brought to that marriage was a family name and a church congregation, and he does not need either one anymore." Camille pressed her left hand flat against the wall beside her. "She is a broke pregnant wife he keeps around for optics," Shanice said. "And we both know how long that lasts." The crystal glasses were still clinking behind Camille. The baby moved. Camille did not move. She stood very still in the hallway. She heard every word, not just with her ears, with the specific part of her that had been waiting, without naming what it was waiting for a very long time. Broke. She almost laughed. She did not. She breathed instead, slow and measured and controlled, the way her grandmother taught her to breathe when she was 8 years old, and something at school had made her want to cry in front of people who would use it against her. "You breathe through the bottom of your lungs, baby. You breathe like you are watering something deep in the ground. Not a fast breath, a roots breath." She breathed her roots breath now. Broke. Lord, if Shanice only knew. Camille had $312 million in private equity positions alone. They were held through a legal structure so carefully built that her grandfather's attorneys had spent 12 years architecting it properly before he handed her the keys. She had spent 5 years quietly expanding what her family gave her. 5 years of reading quarterly statements in her home office at 11 at night after Broderick fell asleep. 5 years of careful, documented strategic decisions that no one in this room knew she was making. She had been building while he had been betraying. The word broke sat in her chest like a stone, and she breathed around it, and she held herself perfectly still in the hallway while Shanice finished the call and checked her lipstick in the dark reflection of her phone screen. Shanice turned and found Camille standing 5 feet away. The two women looked at each other. Shanice's face did something complicated. It went through several expressions quickly before settling on the one she clearly decided was safest. Neutral, professional, unfazed. Camille did not say a word. She turned and walked back toward the ballroom. She found Broderick near the center of the room. He was talking to three men whose names she knew and whose financial history she knew better than they knew themselves. She placed her hand on his arm exactly the way a devoted wife does at a public event. She smiled at the business partners. She waited for a natural break in the conversation. Then she said quietly into her husband's ear, "I will need you to have someone bring the car around. I am leaving. And Broderick, you should know that Shanice is using the hallway near coat check to make personal calls at your professional event. You might want to address that." She did not look back when she walked out. Her heels on the lobby floor, loud, deliberate, hers. The car arrived in 3 minutes. The driver, a man named Carl who had worked for Broderick's company for 4 years and who Camille had always treated with genuine courtesy, held the door for her without a word. She settled into the back seat. She breathed. She watched Atlanta move past the window in the dark. She did not call Broderick. She did not call her mother. She was not ready for her mother to hear it in her voice. Her mother would hear it immediately. Her mother heard everything immediately. Dorothy Whitfield had been hearing things in her daughter's voice for 31 years, and she would not miss this. She called one person. She called her grandfather. He picked up on the second ring. "Grandpa," she said, "it is Camille. I need you to tell me everything is still in place." A pause settled between them. It was not an anxious pause. It was the kind of pause that only two people who have loved each other across decades can hold without either of them panicking. He was letting her breathe. She was breathing. Then his voice came through the phone. Slow, certain, warm as a porch in July. "Baby girl, every penny, always has been." He stopped. "You want to tell your old grandfather what happened tonight?" She did. She told him all of it. Shanice in the hallway. The words. The certainty she had heard in Shanice's voice. The confidence of a woman who believed completely in what she was saying. She told him about the way the ballroom had kept making that sound. Crystal on crystal. Indifferent. Celebratory. Going on without knowing what was happening at its edges. And as she told it, the first tear fell. Not from heartbreak. Not exactly. From the specific grief of having been right about something she had desperately wanted to be wrong about. From the exhaustion of having held her doubts at arm's length for 3 years, pressing them back with the flat of her love, choosing again and again to believe what she needed to believe because the alternative was standing exactly here, in the back of a car at 11 o'clock at night, pregnant with her daughter, and knowing. Her grandfather listened without interrupting. He did not rush to comfort her. He simply held the line and breathed with her the way he had been doing since she was a small child on his porch, trying to explain something too large for her words. When she finished, he said, "You coming home?" "Not yet," she said. "I need to go back to the house first." "All right," he said. "You call me when you get settled. Middle of the night is fine. You know that." "I know, Grandpa, I love you, baby girl. I love you too," she said. She held the phone against her chest for a moment after the call ended. She breathed. She looked at her hands resting on her stomach, where her daughter was quiet now. Like she was listening. Like she already understood that her mother needed a moment of quiet before what came next. "I know," Camille said softly. "I know, baby girl." The house was silent when she arrived home. Broderick was still at the gala. The 12,000 square feet of marble and glass in Buckhead sat in its own composed quiet. The kind of silence that expensive things maintain. Cool and neutral and indifferent, like the crystal had been. Camille moved through the kitchen. She filled a glass of water and stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the dark backyard. The landscaping was precise and perfect and had been designed by someone whose name she could not now remember. She had let Broderick choose everything about this house. She had told herself it was generosity. She understood now that it had been erasure. She put the glass down. She walked to Broderick's home office. She was not looking for anything specific. She told herself that later. She walked to his desk because it was the place in this house that was most completely his. The place she had learned, over 5 years, to leave undisturbed. She was done leaving things undisturbed. The desk was immaculate. Documents stacked with precision. A fountain pen aligned perfectly with the edge of a leather portfolio. 3 framed photographs on the credenza behind the desk. Broderick at his company's founding. Broderick receiving an award. Broderick in a boardroom with men whose names she knew. There was no photograph of their wedding. She registered that fact now with a clarity she had not allowed herself before. She filed it. She opened the center desk drawer, and there it was. A manila folder with a tab label in small typed letters. Not handwritten, typed, as if it had been prepared by someone other than Broderick himself. Professional and clinical and careful. The label read, Whitfield Trust Review. Her name was not on the label. Her name was not on the authorization sheet inside the cover, where a signature line had been filled in by Broderick alone, his signature. His name. His authorization. He had commissioned an audit of her family's trust accounts, without telling her, without asking, without her name on a single piece of the paperwork. He had been trying to find out what she had. He had been scared enough of what he might discover that he paid someone to look, and scared enough of her reaction that he never told her he was looking. The auditors had found nothing. She could see that in the report. Page after page of careful, professional language that ultimately amounted to the conclusion that the Whitfield family's financial holdings were either minimal or structured in a way that was not accessible through standard inquiry. Not accessible through standard inquiry. That phrase made her almost smile. Grandpa's attorneys had built something beautiful. They had built it to be exactly that. Not accessible through standard inquiry. She put the folder back exactly where she found it. She walked upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the room she shared with her husband, and she put both hands on her stomach, and she breathed. She breathed for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried in the car. That was enough for tonight. She breathed instead, like she was watering something deep in the ground. She thought about what her grandfather built. She thought about what her grandmother expanded. She thought about 5 years of quarterly statements, 5 years of careful decisions, 5 years of growing what had been handed to her with love and intention into something that would make every person in that family proud. She thought about the number at the bottom of the most recent statement, $514 million. Built in silence, built in the margins of a life that everyone in that ballroom believed was entirely her husband's. Built during dinners she organized, and events she attended, and conversations she had with people who would become investors, and partners and allies, and none of them knew they were talking to the person who was actually doing the building. Broke. She was the interest on what her family saved, and tomorrow she was going to begin making decisions that reflected that truth. She lay down on top of the covers. She did not take off the burgundy gown. She closed her eyes. She breathed long and slow, one breath for herself, one breath for Eugenia, one breath for the woman she was going to be on the other side of this. She was still breathing when Broderick came home after midnight. She heard his keys on the marble entryway table, the refrigerator opening and closing, his footsteps on the stairs. He opened the bedroom door and looked in. She kept her eyes closed. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he moved to the bathroom. She heard the water run. She heard him moving with the careful quiet of a man who believed his wife was asleep and wanted to keep her that way. She kept breathing. Long. Measured. The specific breathing of a woman who has decided what she is going to do and does not need to announce it tonight. She breathed until his side of the bed settled under his weight and his breathing evened out into sleep. Then she breathed some more. She breathed for her grandmother. She breathed for Eva May, whom she had never met, whose name was on the holding company that held everything. She breathed for her daughter, who did not know yet what she was being born into. And in the deep quiet of a house that had never fully been hers, Camille Eugenia Graves made her list. Camille did not sleep. She lay beside her husband in the dark of a house worth $4 million, and she waited until his breathing reached that particular rhythm. The one she had memorized without meaning to, the way you memorize things you live beside long enough. Deep and even and completely untroubled. Then she rose. She moved through the dark hallway in bare feet. She carried the burgundy gown carefully over her arm, one hand pressed flat against the wall for balance. She had not been able to reach her back zipper since 7 months, and she was not going to wake Broderick to help her now. She found scissors in the craft drawer in the kitchen, and she cut the zipper free and stepped out of the gown without ceremony and left it on the kitchen floor. It was $240 of fabric she had altered twice for his benefit. She would not be altering it again. She put on the cotton house dress she kept hanging on the back of the bathroom door. She made herself a cup of Patience coffee. Her grandmother's recipe, grounds in the pot boiled slow, then you wait. You cannot rush it or it turns bitter. Her grandmother called it Patience coffee because the whole lesson was in the making of it. You had to wait. You had to trust that the waiting was part of the flavor. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she opened her laptop. She was trained as a finance professional, Howard University, class of 2017, magna cum laude. She had graduated second in her cohort in accounting methodology and first in her cohort in portfolio analysis. She had spent 5 years after graduation applying those skills to the management of the Whitfield Family Trust and the investment portfolio her grandfather had built over 40 years. She knew how to read data without panic. You do not speculate. You look at what is actually in front of you. You build the picture from the facts, and then you decide what the picture is telling you. She opened every calendar she had kept for 5 years of marriage. She went through them methodically, date by date, month by month. She began to mark the dates. The Atlanta convention in February of the first year. Broderick had gone alone because she was managing a family health situation with her grandmother's doctors. He had been gone for 5 days. The Charlotte retreat in April of the second year. She had not been invited because it was described to her as a men's leadership weekend. The Houston Investment Summit in September of the second year. She had been invited but had stayed home with a respiratory infection. She marked them with small red notations. Each one. Each date when he had been away without her. Each night she had slept alone in the Buckhead house with the expensive silence keeping her company. By the time she reached the end of the most recent calendar, she had counted 26. 26. She sat with that number. She was a finance woman. She understood that patterns do not become patterns by accident. She understood that 26 events across 5 years was not coincidence and was not business and was not something she could explain away with love any longer. The coffee cooled beside her. She picked it up and drank it cold. She had never minded cold coffee. Her grandmother said only impatient people minded cold coffee. She got up and went to the stove. She put on the smallest pot she owned, and she made another cup, the old way. She let the ground settle to the bottom. She waited. The kitchen smelled like something her grandmother's kitchen had always smelled like. Coffee and the pine cleaner that every black woman in Atlanta apparently bought from the same place. And underneath those smells the faint traces of breakfast from the morning before. She had made eggs. She had made them for 2 people. She had made them the way she always made them, which was the way Broderick liked them, which was not the way she herself particularly preferred them. The small, precise grief of that. The baby moved, a small rolling motion, unhurried. "I am here," Camille said quietly. "I am not going anywhere tonight." She poured the second cup of coffee and sat back down. She opened a second document on her laptop. Not the calendar. This one was encrypted and filed under a name that appeared in the system as financial planning folder. A description boring enough that Broderick had never asked about it in 5 years of occasionally glancing at her laptop screen when he walked behind her. The ledger. Informal but meticulous. Cross-reference with the official documents. 5 years of decisions laid out in her own notation system. Every investment she had moved into position through the Whitfield Family Trust. Every quarterly statement she had reviewed. Every phone call with her grandfather's attorneys that she had taken in her home office with the door closed. The number at the bottom of the ledger did not change just because her marriage was falling apart. It was not capable of that kind of instability. It was 5 years of careful, documented, patient work. $514 million. She had grown the trust from $92 million to $514 million in 5 years, managing her grandfather's legacy with every financial skill Howard had given her and every lesson her grandfather had taught her on that porch in Cascade Heights. She built this while managing Broderick's household. She built this while attending Broderick's events. She built this while supporting the public image of a man who had told his mistress she was broke. "He audited my family's money without my name on the paperwork." That is not a husband making financial inquiries. That is a man preparing for a fight he thinks he has already won. She sat with that thought. She let it be as big as it needed to be. She did not minimize it. She did not spin it into something more comfortable. She let it sit on the table in front of her like the folder in his office, flat and factual and honest. He had commissioned that audit because he suspected she had something, and he had done it without telling her because he was already thinking like an adversary, not like a husband, not like a partner, like a man who was preparing for a fight and wanted to know the full scope of the battlefield before she did. He had not found the battlefield. He did not know what he was looking for. The Whitfield Trust had been restructured in 2009 under a holding company her grandmother named after her own grandmother, Eva May Holdings Incorporated. Most attorneys who were not specifically searching for that chain of ownership would spend 6 months chasing it and not get there. Broderick had given his auditors 6 weeks. He gave up because he assumed there was nothing substantial there, because he had looked at her family and made a decision about what they had based on what he was willing to see. He had been doing that for 5 years. She opened a third document. This one she had not been expecting to open tonight. This one required a different kind of looking. She went back into the financial records, the business accounts, the ones she had co-signature authority on for the first 2 years of the marriage. Broderick had removed her name from the primary accounts in a corporate restructuring in year 3. He had described it as administrative. He had said it was about simplifying the signatory chain. She had signed off on it without reading the subclauses because she trusted him, because that was what she had decided to do. She read the subclauses now. It took her 40 minutes. She had to retrieve 3 separate documents from the encrypted drive to cross-reference the transfers properly. She did this methodically. She was not panicking, she was building the picture. The picture, when it was fully built, was this: Broderick had a secondary limited liability company registered under a name she did not immediately recognize. A middle name, a woman's middle name. She stared at it: Renee, Shanice Renee Fontaine, the secondary LLC was registered under Fontaine Renee Holdings. And the 3 real estate properties listed inside it, 3 commercial properties in the Atlanta metro area, were properties that Camille herself had identified, researched, and recommended. Properties whose acquisition she had negotiated the parameters for during her time as co-signatory. Properties whose down payments had been funded through redirected transfers from the business account she had signed off on in the restructuring. She had signed her name to her own exclusion, her own signature on the transfer documents that moved the money, her signature removing herself from the accounts, her signature on the restructuring agreement she had not fully read. She sat with that for 90 seconds. She gave herself exactly 90 seconds to feel the full specific humiliation of it. The fact of her own careful handwriting on the documents that had been used to build something that excluded her entirely. The fact that he had used her competence against her. That he had asked her to approve the mechanism of her own removal, and she had done it because she trusted him. She gave herself 90 seconds. Then she closed that feeling and filed it where it belonged, into the case. She picked up her phone. She opened her text messages. She wrote to her sister. I need you to be available tomorrow morning. Not as my sister, as my attorney. She put the phone down on the table. She wrapped her hands around the cold coffee cup and she breathed and she watched the Atlanta dark outside the kitchen window begin to give the smallest suggestions of gray at its edges. Gloria's response arrived in under a minute. I have been ready for 3 years. What time? Camille read her sister's words twice. Then she read them a third time. 3 years. Gloria had been watching this marriage for 3 years and had never said a word. She had held her professional opinion in silence because Camille had not asked for it. Because that was the agreement between them. You wait until you are needed. You do not push the door open on someone's life until they invite you through. Gloria had been standing outside the door with her legal pads and her 15 years of family law experience for 3 years, waiting to be invited. Camille typed back 6 in the morning. Mama's house. She put the phone down. She looked at the 26 marks in the calendar document. She looked at the number at the bottom of the ledger. She looked at the name on the secondary limited liability company that held the 3 properties she had identified and negotiated. She was not angry yet. That would come. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming in from the west. It was not here yet, but it was coming and it was going to be substantial. For now, she was simply clear. She had the data. She had the documentation. She had her grandfather's financial architecture and her own 5 years of decisions and her sister on the other end of a text message who had been waiting 3 years for this morning. She was 8 months pregnant and sitting alone at a kitchen table in a house that had never fully been hers. And she was the most strategically positioned person in this situation. She was the only one who knew the full landscape. Broderick knew his half. He did not know hers. She was going to make sure he understood hers. She closed the laptop. She made one more cup of Patience coffee. She drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the gray in the Atlanta sky become something closer to pink, and she breathed all the way down to the ground. One breath for herself. One breath for Eugenia. One breath for the morning she was about to walk into. She was ready. She thought about the moment, somewhere in year 2, when she had noticed that Broderick stopped asking about her grandfather's trust accounts. He had asked about them 3 or 4 times in the early months of the marriage, casual questions wrapped in what sounded like genuine curiosity. How is the old man's portfolio doing? What kind of return is the family seeing on those old Alabama land holdings? She had answered briefly and warmly and steered the conversation elsewhere, and eventually he stopped asking. She had understood even then that he stopped asking because he had decided the answer was not worth pursuing. He had looked at her family and seen a schoolteacher and a postal worker and a retired grandfather on a porch in Cascade Heights, and he had calculated what that likely added up to and decided it was not significant enough to require his attention. He had been wrong. He had been profoundly, specifically, and operationally wrong. She had grown up watching her grandfather move through the world. She had grown up understanding, from the time she was old enough to sit on that porch and listen, that the most important thing about the Whitfield family's wealth was not the amount. It was the structure. It was the legal architecture built over 3 generations of deliberate, documented, Strategic decisions made by people who understood that black wealth in America did not survive by being obvious. It survived by being exact. She had learned that lesson at 8 years old. She had been applying it at 31. And now the man who dismissed her family as a family name in a church congregation was about to discover what 5 years of patient, exact, structurally sound decision-making looked like when you brought it into the light. She set her coffee cup down. She pulled the laptop back open. She spent the next hour reviewing the specific language in the secondary limited liability company documents. She noted every provision. She noted every date. She cross-referenced the transfer records against the dates in her calendar document. The pattern was not subtle once you were looking for it. The money had moved in carefully constructed tranches, small enough individually not to raise immediate questions, large enough added together, to represent a significant portion of the down payment capital on 3 commercial properties. She had co-signed the authorization for those transfers without knowing where they were going. That was going to be a very useful fact. She made 3 notes in a new document. Short, specific. The kind of notes you write when you are not writing for yourself, but for the attorney who will need to turn them into legal language in approximately 4 hours. She wrote transfer dates, cross-reference with calendar entries, LLC, registration date versus restructuring agreement signature date. Then she wrote, my signature on restructuring agreement. What disclosure was legally required? What disclosure was not provided? Then she wrote 3 properties. My identification, my negotiation parameters, my recommendations, his execution, her name on the holding structure. She saved the document. She closed the laptop. She went upstairs. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom, and she looked at her husband sleeping. He slept on his back with one arm across his eyes, which was how he had always slept, which was a thing she knew about him the way you know things about someone you have shared a bed with for 5 years. Unremarkably, automatically, the accumulated intimacy of proximity. She had given him 5 years of proximity. She had given him her name in rooms where it gave him credibility. She had given him her connections, her intelligence, her organizational genius, her genuine effort to make every event he hosted feel like the kind of event that people remembered. She had given him those things freely and without keeping score because she had loved him and because she had believed in what they were building together. She had also been building something of her own. She turned away from the doorway. She went to the guest room at the end of the hall. She lay down on top of the covers. She closed her eyes. She thought about her grandmother making Patience coffee at 4 in the morning when the house was quiet and she was working through something she needed to work through alone. She had watched her grandmother do this many times without understanding what it was for. Now she understood. You made the coffee because your hands needed something honest to do, something that required attention and patience and produced a result you could taste, while the rest of you was doing the harder work. She closed her eyes. She breathed. She slept. The evening had started at 6:30. Camille had dressed at 5. She had taken longer than usual, not because she was uncertain about the gown, but because she was trying to locate a particular internal steadiness before she walked into the building. She had stood at the bathroom mirror in the Buckhead house for 11 minutes after she finished her makeup, looking at herself. Not critically, not with the particular cruelty that mirrors sometimes invite, just looking, trying to see herself clearly. She was 8 months pregnant. She was 31 years old. She had a Howard degree and a mind for financial architecture that her grandfather had been proud of since she was 19 years old, and had correctly identified a problem in the way he had structured a particular landholding. She had been right, and he had changed the structure, and he had told her grandmother that night over dinner that their granddaughter was going to be extraordinary. She looked at herself in the mirror, and she looked at all of that, the degree and the mind and the grandfather's faith and the specific intelligence she had been carrying quietly for 31 years, and she said out loud to the woman in the mirror, "You are ready for tonight." She had not known what she was getting ready for. She knew now. In the car on the way home from the gala before she called her grandfather, she had thought about the word. Broke. She had turned it over in her mind the way you turn something over to look at it from every angle, to understand what it is and what it is not. She knew what broke felt like. She had felt it once, briefly, in the first semester at Howard, when her financial aid had been delayed and she had $32 in her bank account for 11 days, and she had eaten ramen from the campus store and borrowed cab fare from Nisi and had not told her parents, because she was 20 years old and determined to manage it herself. $32. She had counted it out into a pile on her dorm room desk and looked at it and felt what broke felt like. That feeling had never left her entirely. She had carried it into every financial decision she had made since then as a reminder, not of scarcity, of what she was building against, of the specific importance of the work her grandfather had started and that she was continuing, of the reason you built legal structures around your wealth and diversified your positions and kept detailed records and never ever assumed that what you had today was guaranteed tomorrow. She had carried that $32 in her memory for 12 years. She was worth $514 million. She was not broke. She was not even close to broke. She was as far from broke as it was possible to be, while standing in the same corridor as a woman who was using that word to describe her, and the distance between where Shanice thought she was standing and where she was actually standing was so enormous that Camille had briefly, genuinely almost laughed. She did not, she breathed instead. She behaved with the dignity she had been maintaining in difficult moments since she was 8 years old. But she filed the laugh. She was going to feel it fully someday, when all of this was behind her. She was going to let herself feel the full absurdity of it. A woman who did not know what she was looking at, calling a woman who had grown $92 million to $514 million in 5 years a broke pregnant wife. The absurdity of it would keep her warm for years. In the house, after she had stood at Broderick's desk and found the folder, she had stood very still for 3 full minutes. She had put one hand on the desk. She had breathed. She had let the full weight of what she was looking at settle into her before she decided what to do with it. He had been planning this. Not tonight. Not as a response to being caught. He had been planning this before the gala, before the hallway, before any of this became visible. He had commissioned that audit because he knew something was coming, and he wanted to know the full scope of what he was facing before it arrived. He had been thinking like an adversary. She had been thinking like a wife. That difference was going to matter in every document that came next. She put the folder back exactly as she found it. She was careful about the angle, the way it sat against the other documents. She left no evidence that she had been in this office at all. She was a woman who paid attention to detail, and she was not going to surrender that skill tonight because she was in emotional pain. She moved through the house. She climbed the stairs. She sat on the edge of the bed, and she breathed and she waited, and she understood for the first time that she had been waiting for something for a very long time, and she had finally arrived at the thing she had been waiting for. It was not what she would have chosen, it was what she had. She knew what to do with what she had. She had always known what to do with what she had. At 3 in the morning, the house made its sounds. Houses have specific sounds at 3 in the morning. The cooling of materials, the settling of foundations, the particular quiet that exists only in the deepest part of the night, when even the city around the house has reduced itself to its minimum. Car sounds in the distance, an airplane, a dog somewhere 3 streets away that barked twice and stopped. Camille sat at the kitchen table, and she listened to the house. She had thought, in the first year of living in it, that this house would feel like hers eventually, that the accumulation of days inside it would make it home. She had been wrong about that. You could not accumulate your way into belonging in a space that was not designed around you. This house had been designed around Broderick's sense of what his life should look like, around the image he carried of what a successful man's home communicated about him. Everything in it was correct and expensive and selected with that image in mind. There was not a single room in it that had been designed around who Camille actually was. She had not said this to him. She had not said it to anyone. She had said it to herself, privately, at 3 in the morning, in the same way she was saying it now, filing it in the part of herself that she kept separate from the performing part, the part that was always underneath everything clear. She looked at the kitchen table. It was a good table, solid, beautiful, even. Brazilian walnut, she thought, though she had not been the one to choose it. She had spent 5 years eating at it. She had made hundreds of meals in this kitchen and served them at this table, and had conversations at this table, and had sat at this table on quiet Sunday mornings with her coffee, while Broderick read his phone, and the city beyond the window went about its business. She had sat at this table. She had never felt at home at this table. She thought about her mother's kitchen table, the one with the burn mark from the iron, the one that smelled like pine cleaner and sweet potato pie, and 38 years of a family living around it. She had felt at home at that table since before she was old enough to know what home meant. She had done homework at that table and eaten grits at that table and cried at that table when things at school were bad and laughed at that table until her mother told her to settle down. That table was hers. This one never had been. She made a note in the ledger document, not a financial note, a note about the table, about the specific texture of not being home inside your own life, about what it meant to have spent 5 years in a house that was designed to communicate something about someone else's success. She was going to have a kitchen table that was hers. She was going to sit at a table where the burn mark came from something her daughter did, something she would keep rather than replace, because it would remind her that good judgment is something you develop by making expensive mistakes first. She was going to be home. She made that decision at 3 in the morning at a kitchen table that had never been hers, and she noted it the same way she noted every significant decision, with the specificity of something she intended to remember and act on. When she went back over her financial decisions from the previous 4 years, she was struck, not for the first time, by the pattern in them. She had not been making safe investments. She had been making confident ones. The kind of decisions that come from someone who understands the material completely and has a clear sense of where it is going. She had never doubted herself in those decisions. She had reviewed the analysis and she had made the calls, and they had been right more often than not, and when they had not been right, she had understood why and had adjusted. She had been confident in those rooms. She had been confident in those decisions. She had been exactly herself, exactly the Howard finance graduate, and the Whitfield family financial manager, and the woman her grandfather had trusted with the legacy, in every conversation with Henderson Wallace, and every call with the financial analysts, and every document she had reviewed and signed. And then she had come home to this kitchen and made dinner for a man who thought she was decoration. The specific pain of that was not primarily about him. It was about herself. About the woman who had contained all of that capability inside a performance of graceful invisibility for 5 years. About the specific choice she had made again and again to keep herself small in this house so that the house would not have to make room for her. She was done making that choice. She was done making herself small in any room. She was going back to her actual size. When Gloria arrived at 6:30, she set the coffees down and opened the document case, and the three of them, Camille, Dorothy, and Gloria, sat at the kitchen table, and the kitchen became what it had always been at its best. A room where Whitfield women did the hardest things, and helped each other do the hardest things, and got through the hardest things, without any one of them having to be alone in it. Dorothy got up twice to refill things and to wipe down a counter that did not need wiping because her hands also needed something to do. She did not add to the legal conversation. She held the space. She kept the coffee coming and the room warm and the atmosphere dignified, which was something Dorothy Whitfield had always known how to do without being asked. Gloria asked Camille about the timeline of the restructuring agreement. When it had been signed, what had been disclosed before the signing, whether there had been separate legal counsel provided to Camille at the time of signing, or whether she had been expected to review it without representation. Camille said, he said it was administrative. He said he had his firm's attorneys review it. He said it was standard language. Gloria wrote this down. She said, without looking up, he presented a legal agreement to you, drafted by his attorneys, for your signature, without recommending that you seek independent counsel. Camille said yes. Gloria's pen did not stop moving. She said, in a high-asset business context, with spousal co-signature authority involved. Without separate representation, Camille said, yes. Gloria set the pen down. She looked at her sister. She said, Amani is going to enjoy this. Camille had not been in many legal situations in her life. She was not a litigious person. She was a person who settled things through documentation and clear thinking and direct conversation. She did not like the idea of courts and filings and the specific machinery of legal conflict. But she was beginning to understand that in this situation, the legal machinery was not the conflict. It was the clarification. It was the mechanism by which what was actually true would be made visible in a way that could not be argued with. And that was something she had always believed in, deeply and practically. She believed in documentation. She believed in records. She believed in the specific power of having written something down correctly and completely. She was about to use all of those beliefs in a context she had never anticipated. She was ready. She said, there is one more thing. The 3 properties. She walked Gloria through the specific properties, the addresses which she had memorized, the original recommendation documents she had prepared, which were stored in the encrypted drive, the negotiation parameters she had set, which had shaped the ultimate purchase prices, the connection between those recommendations and the eventual structures Broderick had used. She said, he took my work and put it in a structure with her name on it. Gloria said, he took your intellectual work and your negotiated value and structured the benefit away from you. Camille said, yes. Gloria made a note. Then she made another note. Then she underlined something. She said, we are going to need to look very carefully at whether your original recommendation documents constitute something that could be characterized as professional contribution to those assets, and whether the restructuring agreement's removal of your co-signature authority created a situation where contribution without corresponding compensation or ownership can be argued. Camille said, I thought about that too. Gloria said, of course you did. Dorothy set a plate of toast in the center of the table without a word. Gloria took a piece without looking up from her notepad. Camille took a piece. They ate toast at the kitchen table where everything important had happened in this family for 38 years, and they kept working. Outside, the October morning settled into itself. Children were leaving for school. A neighbor's car started in the driveway. The neighborhood began its day with complete indifference to what was being built at the kitchen table inside this particular house. That was the thing about hard work. It looked like an ordinary morning from the outside. You had to be inside it to understand that something was being made. Something was being made. Camille was making it. Her mother and sister were making it with her. And in the offices of Amani Cross on Peachtree Street, a woman who had spent 20 years building exactly this kind of case was sitting with a strong cup of coffee and a legal pad, reading the preliminary documents Gloria had emailed at 5 in the morning and writing the first notes of what would become, in her professional estimation, one of the most clearly structured divorce proceedings she had encountered in 2 decades of practice. In the boardroom of Graves Capital at 7 in the morning, Warren Darnell Price sat across from Broderick, and he let his face do nothing because he had learned a long time ago that there were moments in professional life when the most useful thing you could offer was a neutral surface. He was not neutral inside. Inside, he was sitting with 3 years of decisions he had watched Broderick make and had not said enough about. He was sitting with the specific memory of the moment, 2 years ago, when he had understood what was developing between Broderick and Shanice Fontaine and had made the choice not to say what he understood. He had told himself it was not his business. He had told himself that personal matters were personal and that his role was financial and that the line between the two was one he should not cross. He had been wrong. He understood now that not saying something when you know something is not neutrality. It is a choice. It is a specific choice that has consequences, and the consequences of his choice had included allowing a situation to develop that was now threatening the stability of a company he had spent 15 years building alongside Broderick. A company that managed $3 billion in black business assets. A company whose institutional importance to its investors and its community required, among other things, that the people running it behave with integrity. Broderick had not been behaving with integrity, and Warren had not said so. He sat across from his employer at 7 in the morning, and he listened to Broderick ask how much Camille understood, and he told the truth about the answer, and afterward he watched Broderick go quiet, with the particular quietness of a man who has miscalculated something significant. He stayed in the meeting for another 40 minutes. He reviewed the financial items that were on the agenda. He answered the questions he was asked. He did his job, and when the meeting ended and the room cleared, he sat alone in the boardroom for a moment, and he made a decision. He picked up his phone. He called his wife. He said, I need to talk to an attorney today about what I know and what my legal obligations are going to be. His wife said, then you had better call one today. He said, I know. She said, Warren, what kind of attorney? He said, someone who handles professional disclosures. Someone who can tell me what my responsibility is when I know something that is relevant to a legal proceeding that is about to happen. There was a brief silence. His wife said, are you going to do the right thing? He said, I am trying to figure out what the right thing is. She said, Warren. He said, I am going to do the right thing. She said, good. I will help you find the attorney. He sat in the empty boardroom for another 6 minutes after he ended the call. He looked at the framed photographs on the walls, the awards, the milestones, the evidence of what they had built, he and Broderick, over 15 years. He thought about Camille Eugenia Whitfield Graves, who had been in this building more times than he could count, who had sat in this room at events and board dinners, and who had spoken, when she spoke, with a precision and clarity that he had always noted and that he had always known was more than decorative, who had managed her family's financial interests. He understood now, with a sophistication that the man who shared her house had entirely failed to recognize. He thought about the moment 18 months ago when he had seen her looking at a document at one of these events. She had been holding it the way a person holds a document when they actually understand it, not the way people hold documents to appear engaged, the way of someone reading it with a specific and active intelligence. He had thought at the time that she was impressive. He had not said so. He should have said so. He stood up. He gathered his things. He walked out of the boardroom and he called his wife back and he said, I am ready. Let us find the attorney. There is a specific quality to October mornings in Atlanta that exists nowhere else in the city's calendar. The summer heat has finally agreed to leave. The light comes in at an angle. It does not come in at any other time of year, golden and sideways and generous without being harsh. The trees are deciding whether to turn. Some of them have started. Others are holding on to their green with the stubbornness of things that are not ready. Camille sat in her grandfather's second chair, and she breathed October in Atlanta. She had grown up in this city. She had left it briefly for Washington, D.C., and then returned, and she had never fully understood why she needed to return until she was back, and she could breathe this air again. There was something in it that was specific to here. Specific to this particular city and this particular neighborhood and this particular porch and this particular quality of morning light. Her grandfather said, "After a while, your grandmother loved this time of year." Camille said, "I know. She used to say October was when Atlanta remembered what it was supposed to look like." He smiled. A slow smile, the kind of smile that contains a memory of a person clearly. "She did say that." He paused. "She said a lot of things that I have been thinking about for the past 3 years." Camille looked at him. "What kind of things?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She told me once that the biggest mistake we make with our children and grandchildren is giving them the practical tools without giving them the emotional tools to use the practical tools right. She said money without self-knowledge is just fuel for someone else's fire." Camille was quiet. He said, "I have thought about that a lot, about whether I gave you enough of both, the practical and the emotional." She said, "Grandpa," he said, "you are here, you are handling this. You know exactly what you have and what to do with it. So maybe I did all right." She put her hand on his arm. She said, "You did all right." He covered her hand with his. They breathed together. The thing about her grandfather's porch was that it was the most honest place she had ever been. There was nothing performing about it. There was no design involved, no aesthetic statement, no communication about status or achievement or aspiration. There was just the porch and the two chairs and the neighborhood he had chosen in 1979 because he believed in it. Because he believed that the investment he was making in that house and that street was an investment in what the neighborhood was going to be and what his family was going to be in it. He had been right about all of it. She breathed the porch air, and she felt the truth of the place settle into her. The specific truth of a family that had built things without being visible about the building, that had made strategic decisions without announcing them, that had protected what was theirs with legal structures and careful documentation, and the consistent refusal to let anyone else determine the shape of what they were. She was that family. She was those women. She was going to be those women for her daughter. She was going to sit on a porch somewhere with Eugenia and tell her the same story her grandfather had told her today. The whole story. Every name. Every decision. Eva A's shoes and Earl's sharecropped land and Reginald's downtown brokerage account and her grandmother's online finance courses at 63. She was going to tell her all of it, because that was the only way it survived. Not in the accounts. Not in the structures, though those were necessary. In the telling. In the specific act of one generation handing the knowledge to the next and saying, "This is where we come from. This is what we built. This is what it cost, and this is what it gave us, and this is now yours to carry and grow." Eugenia was going to know her history. Camille was going to make sure of it. The blood pressure cuff sat on Dorothy's kitchen table after Nisi finished with it, a small and practical object that had somehow become, in the context of this morning, the most comforting thing in the room. Camille looked at it. She thought about all the things that Nisi had brought with her on the drive up from Charlotte, not just the cuff and the oxtail. She had brought herself. She had driven 4 hours in the dark of a weekday morning because Gloria had sent 3 words, and she had recognized immediately what those 3 words meant, and she had gotten in the car. This was what Camille had built over 15 years of friendship with Nisi Marie Holloway. Not just the affection, though the affection was real and deep. The specific trust that meant you did not have to explain everything. You could send 3 words, and the person on the other end would understand what you needed and would move. She had people who moved. She thought about all the events, all the galas, all the board dinners, where she had stood beside Broderick and smiled at his partners and their wives and had performed the specific version of connection that those rooms required. Warm but not intimate, interested but not personal, the kind of connection that served the event rather than the people. She had spent 5 years in those rooms performing connection. And the real thing, the thing that drove 4 hours in the dark and brought oxtail and took blood pressure readings and said, "I know," in the middle of the worst contractions, the real connection had been here, in this kitchen. In Nisi's apartment in Charlotte, on the phone at midnight when one of them needed the other one to just breathe on the other end of the line. She was not going to be alone in this. She had never been alone in this. She had just been for a while too much inside the performance of a particular kind of life to feel the real life that was running underneath it. After Niecy left that evening, after the dishes were done and Dorothy was reading, and the house had settled into its evening self, Camille sat on the back porch. She had not intended to sit there. She had been walking to the guest room, and she had passed the back door, and she had stopped, and she had opened it, and she had sat down on the top step of the 3 back porch steps, and she had looked at her mother's garden. October bare and quiet. The rose bushes were down to their stalks. The herbs had gone dormant. The small stand of ornamental grasses at the back fence had turned their autumn gold. But the beds were still clearly tended, still clearly loved. You could see in the way the soil had been turned and the way the edges of the beds were clean that someone had been here recently, that someone had been taking care of this even though there was nothing blooming to reward the taking of care. She looked at the garden. The neighborhood moved around her. Someone calling a child in for dinner. The sound of a television from the house next door. A car on the street. Somewhere, someone's music, slow and distant and unconcerned with anything that was happening in this backyard. She breathed. She thought about nothing specific. She let the evening do what evenings do when you are not trying to make them do anything else. She breathed the October air, and she listened to the sounds, and she felt the specific solidity of the porch step under her, which was old wood but sound wood, maintained the way her mother maintained everything, with the careful and consistent attention of a woman who understood that what you take care of stays. She put her hands on her stomach. Her daughter moved. A slow rolling motion. Unhurried. Like someone stretching. She said quietly, "We are all right, baby girl. We are going to be all right." She sat there until the air got too cold for an 8-month pregnant woman to be sitting on porch steps. Then she went inside. She made one more cup of patience coffee. She drank it at the kitchen table in the quiet of her mother's house. And she was not afraid. Camille left Buckhead before dawn. She packed one bag, practical, not symbolic. Clothes for 3 days, her prenatal vitamins, the encrypted drive that held the ledger, her phone charger, and the small Bible her grandmother had given her when she graduated from Howard. She did not take anything that was jointly owned. She did not take anything that was his. She took only what had always been entirely hers. She left no note. She did not send a text. She drove her own car south on Interstate 85. In the last hour of the Atlanta night, the city moving past her in its pre-dawn version, quieter and stranger and more honest than it ever looked in daylight. She had the windows cracked. The air was October cool, and it smelled like the particular version of Atlanta that she had grown up in before she grew into the version of Atlanta that lived in Buckhead and attended galas at the Harrington Hotel. She drove toward the Atlanta of her childhood. The East Atlanta neighborhood where her mother's house sat on a street of similar houses. Modest and meticulous. Houses that had been there for 40 years and intended to be there for 40 more. Houses that smelled, inside, like pine cleaner and sweet potato pie. She did not have to call ahead. Dorothy Whitfield had been sleeping lightly for 3 years. She heard her daughter's car in the driveway at 4:45 in the morning. She was on the porch before Camille reached the front steps, wearing the old housecoat with the small roses on it that she had owned since 1999, and the reading glasses pushed up on her forehead from the book she had been reading in bed. She did not say anything when she saw Camille. She simply opened her arms. Camille walked into them. She did not cry. She breathed, long and careful, with her face pressed against her mother's shoulder, and she felt 60% of the weight she had been carrying move from her own body into someone strong enough to hold it. Her mother was not a large woman, but she had a way of standing that made her feel enormous, like a tree, like something that had roots going down into the earth farther than you could see. Dorothy held her for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "Come inside, I am making grits." This was what Mama Dorothy did. Every crisis in this family had been met with food and the specific kitchen warmth of a woman who understood that the body needed to be cared for before the heart could be addressed. You could not process heartbreak on an empty stomach. You could not make clear decisions when your blood sugar was low. These were not things Dorothy had ever said out loud. They were things she practiced without announcing them. Camille sat at the kitchen table she had been sitting at her entire life. The one with the small burn mark near the left edge from 1998, when her sister Gloria tried to iron her homecoming dress on it. The iron had been too hot, and the tablecloth had scorched in a small oval shape, and their mother had never replaced the tablecloth because she said it reminded her that good judgment was not something you were born with. It was something you developed, usually by making expensive mistakes first. Camille put her hands around the warm mug her mother set in front of her. She breathed in the steam, cinnamon and coffee, and the particular warmth of her mother's kitchen, which smelled different from every kitchen she had been in since she left this one. Warmer, rooted. like something that was not performing comfort but actually generating it. She told her mother everything. Her mother stirred the grits and listened. She did not interrupt. She did not rush to respond. She adjusted the heat under the pot twice and added butter when it was time to add butter, and she listens the way she has listens to her daughters, with every part of her body pointed in their direction. When Camille finished, Dorothy put down the spoon. She turned around, she said, "Baby, I need to tell you something I should have told you before your wedding." Camille looked at her mother. Dorothy brought 2 mugs of Patience coffee to the table. The old way, grounds in the pot, already settled. She sat down across from her daughter and she wrapped both hands around her own mug and she was quiet for a moment. This was the breathing room, and Camille felt it open up around them. The kitchen was warm. The grits were finishing on the stove, a soft sound of the pot and the slight tremor of the surface as they settled. Outside, very faintly, the neighborhood was beginning to wake. A dog somewhere 2 houses down. A car starting on the next street. The particular sound of a neighborhood deciding to become morning. Camille breathed the coffee steam. Her mother began to speak. She said that 18 months into her marriage to Camille's father, she had almost left. Not because of another woman, not because of cruelty, because of invisibility. Because she had looked up one ordinary Tuesday morning and could not find herself anywhere in her own life. She had looked at the kitchen table, the one they were sitting at right now, and she had looked at the grocery lists and the church schedule and the calendar full of other people's needs, and she had understood that she had disappeared into her own household and no one had noticed. Not even her. She had thought about leaving for 11 days. On the 12th day, she had gone to see her own mother, Camille's grandmother, and she had told her what she was feeling. And her mother had said something she had never forgotten. She said a woman who has disappeared inside her own life has 2 choices. She can leave and find herself somewhere new, or she can stay and find herself right here. Both take the same amount of courage. The only wrong choice is to stay invisible. Dorothy had stayed. She had rebuilt herself inside the marriage. She had reclaimed her own voice, slowly, and she had become a woman her husband learned to see again, and they had built 32 more years together, and some of those years had been genuinely good. But she did not know to this day whether she had made the right choice, whether she had stayed because she wanted to or because she was afraid of what leaving looked like. She carried that uncertainty in her chest, like a smooth stone that she had learned to breathe around. "I am not going to tell you what to do," Dorothy said. "I am going to tell you what I know. What I know is that you were never broke. Not one day of your life. Your grandfather made sure of that before you were old enough to understand what he was making sure of. And whatever that man thinks he knows about you, he does not know the half of it." She reached across the table. She put her hand over Camille's hand. "You know your own truth," Dorothy said. "You always have. You just needed to trust it." They ate grits in the warm quiet of the kitchen. They did not talk about Broderick. They talked about the baby. About the room at Camille's friend Nisi's house that Nisi had been painting for months in preparation for the baby's first visit. About the name Eugenia, which had been in the Whitfield family for 4 generations, and which Camille had chosen without asking anyone's permission, and which Dorothy had cried over quietly when she heard it. At 6:30 in the morning, a car pulled into the driveway. Camille recognized the sound of her sister's Volvo. Gloria Whitfield had driven 3 hours from Birmingham, Alabama, in the dark, arriving at their mother's house at 6:30 in the morning with a leather document case under her arm and 2 large coffees from the gas station she had stopped at somewhere on Interstate 20. She was wearing the clothes she had clearly pulled on in a hurry. Her hair was natural and not yet styled. She looked in every way like a woman who had been waiting for this phone call for a long time and had moved the moment it arrived. She set the coffees on the table. She sat down. She opened the document case. She looked at her sister. "Tell me what he found when he audited the trust account," she said. Not as a sister. As an attorney, the shift was subtle and complete. The same voice, the same face, but with a new precision behind the eyes. Camille said, "Nothing. Because I moved everything into a structure Grandpa's attorneys built in 2009. It predates any common property consideration under Georgia statute by 17 years. The restructuring was legal, documented, and entirely transparent to the IRS. What it was not transparent to was any auditor who did not know specifically what to look for." Gloria put her pen down. She stared at her sister for a long moment. Then she said, "Camille Eugenia Whitfield." She stopped. She picked up her coffee. She took a long sip. She set it down. "You beautiful, quiet, terrifying woman." Camille almost smiled. "There is also a secondary limited liability company," Camille said, "registered under a name I need to show you. It holds 3 commercial properties that I identified, researched, and recommended. The down payments were funded through transfers I co-signed without knowing where they were going. The restructuring agreement I signed in year 3 removed my name from the primary accounts and redirected authorization in ways that were not fully disclosed to me at the time of signing. Gloria had the pen back in her hand before Camille finished the sentence. She was writing. That, Gloria said, without looking up from the notepad, is going to be very useful. I thought so, Camille said. They worked for 2 hours at their mother's kitchen table. Dorothy made more coffee. She replaced the grits with eggs and toast. She moved around her kitchen like a woman who understood that the most important thing she could do right now was to make sure the space held warmth and food and the specific dignity of a kitchen that had seen hard things before and come through them. Outside the window, the October morning settled into itself. The neighborhood finished waking up. The sound of children leaving for school. The particular sound of a life going on at its ordinary pace, while something extraordinary was being built at a kitchen table on the same street where that life was happening. By 9 in the morning, Camille had walked her sister through every document she had brought, every notation in the ledger, every date in the calendar, every subclause in the restructuring agreement she had not read carefully enough. Gloria called Imani Cross at 9:15. She said into the phone, "I need you to clear your morning. I have a situation that is going to be one of the most satisfying cases of your career." Imani Cross was not a morning person. She was a professional, which in her case meant that the distinction between morning and not morning had long since become irrelevant in the face of what needed to be done. When Gloria Whitfield called at 9:15 with the words, "My sister, 8 months pregnant, Graves Capital, and the Whitfield Trust," Imani Cross had a legal notepad open and a second cup of coffee in hand before the sentence was finished. She had been doing high-asset divorce work for 20 years. She had seen the full range of what people did to each other when money and love stopped being the same thing. She had seen financial betrayals elegant and crude, sophisticated and obvious. She had seen men who thought they were clever and men who actually were clever, and the very different legal challenges they each presented. She had rarely seen a situation like the one Gloria was now laying out for her over the phone. When Gloria finished the initial summary, Imani was quiet for approximately 15 seconds. Then she said, "Tell your sister not to speak to her husband without me present. Tell her not to return to the marital home for any reason without documentation of the visit. Tell her to send me a secure copy of everything she brought with her, and tell her she is in an excellent position." While Imani Cross was reviewing those first documents in her office on Peachtree Street, 45 minutes across the city, Broderick Kingston Graves was already in his own boardroom. He had not slept. He had come home at midnight to find his wife apparently sleeping, and he had lain beside her in the dark, and he had understood, without being able to name exactly how he understood it, that something had changed in the room. Some specific gravity. Something that was present before he left for the gala and was not present when he came home. He had told himself he was imagining it. He had not slept. By 6 in the morning, he was in the Graves Capital offices. By 7, he was in an emergency meeting with Warren Darnell Price, his chief financial officer, a man Broderick had worked with for 15 years. A man who had watched this company grow from a 2-person operation in a shared office space to a private equity firm managing $3 billion in black business assets. Warren Price had a particular face, careful and even and professionally arranged at all times. He had a talent for listening without expression that had served him well in 15 years of boardrooms and negotiations. He sat across from Broderick now with that face, and he listened while Broderick explained what had happened, what Shanice had said in the hallway, what Camille had overheard. When Broderick finished, there was a silence. Then Broderick said, "How much do you think she understood?" Warren Price looked at his employer for a long moment. He said, "Broderick, she went to Howard University. She managed her family's trust for 3 years before you married her. She has been sitting in every meeting, every event, every board dinner for 5 years, absorbing everything in that room." He paused. She understood all of it. Silence. Broderick had built his empire in part on his ability to read a room. He was skilled at it. He understood people's motivations, and he understood leverage, and he understood the precise moment when someone across the table had decided they were done negotiating. He had made his professional reputation on knowing before it was visible what the person he was dealing with had decided. He had spent 5 years not applying any of that skill to his wife. He had not thought he needed to. He looked at the wall of his boardroom, at the framed photographs, the award certificates, the plaques, the evidence of everything he had built. He had built it in part on her connections, her credibility, Her presence in rooms where her family name opened doors and her grace kept them open, and her specific intelligence made everyone in those rooms think well of Graves' capital by association. He had built it in part on her, and he had not thought of that as a fact relevant to the current situation because he had not thought, until approximately 3 hours ago, that the current situation was going to require legal consideration. He had been preparing for a fight, the audit, the LLC under Shanice's middle name, the restructuring agreement. All of it had been building toward a future he had been planning without naming it. He had assumed he was the one who was ready. Warren Price looked at him from across the table and did not say what he was thinking. What he was thinking was that he had spent 3 years watching this situation develop and had said nothing, and he was beginning to ask himself what his silence had cost and what the cost might be in the future. These were not comfortable thoughts. He held them carefully and said nothing. Broderick's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Camille. He did not answer. He sat in his boardroom at 7:20 in the morning and let his wife's call go to voicemail. In Dorothy Whitfield's kitchens, Camille put the phone back on the table face down. She had not actually called Broderick. She had only looked at his name in her contacts and set the phone down. She was not calling him. She was noting that she was not calling him and feeling the absence of urgency about that, which told her something about where she had arrived. Gloria looked up from the notepad. "His name on the screen?" she asked. "No," Camille said. "Just thinking." Gloria nodded and went back to writing. At 10 in the morning, Amani Cross's assistant emailed Gloria with a proposed meeting time for the following morning. Gloria confirmed. She showed Camille the email. Camille read it. Then she picked up the legal documents Gloria had brought and she turned to the first page. She looked at her married name printed at the top of the first form, Camille Eugenia Graves. The name she had carried for 5 years. The name she had spoken in every room she had entered since the wedding, the name she had used to vouch for her husband in spaces where he needed vouching, the name she had written on cards and letters and emails to people who now associated it entirely with his empire. Her grandfather's name was Whitfield. Her grandmother's name was Whitfield. The holding company was Eva May Holdings. She was Whitfield in every room that mattered, in every document that would outlast this marriage. She picked up the pen. She signed Camille Eugenia Whitfield Graves. Both names, her full name. She was keeping all of herself. She did not explain this to Gloria. She did not need to. Gloria looked at the signature and said nothing. Then she reached across and put her hand on her sister's hand for exactly 1 second. Then she turned back to her notepad. At 11 in the morning, Camille's phone showed a text from a number she had saved as Marvella Hughes. Marvella Hughes was the head of the women's circle at New Covenant Baptist Church, the church where Camille and Broderick had been married. A woman of 55 who had been a force in that church for 30 years and who had always treated Camille with a specific and steady warmth, the warmth of a woman who recognizes in another woman something she has been watching for. The text said, "Baby, Patricia called me this morning. Are you all right? Whatever you need, the women's circle is here." Camille read the text 3 times. She put the phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the October morning. Then she picked it up and read it a 4th time. Patricia had called Marvella. Patricia, who sat at galas with the specific expression of someone who suspects something and is relieved not to have to name it. Patricia, who had seen something last night and had picked up the phone by morning. The community was already moving. It was moving toward her before it even knew the full truth. It was moving on instinct, on the long practice of women looking out for each other, on the network of attention and care that had always held people together in this church and this neighborhood and this version of Atlanta that Broderick Kingston Graves had not grown up in and had never fully understood. That community was not his. She had understood from the moment she overheard Shanice in the hallway that what was about to happen would unfold in front of every person who had attended her wedding. She would have to decide how she carried herself through that. She had been making that decision her entire life. She had carried herself through 31 years as a Whitfield, with the specific posture of a family that had been building things in silence while the world assumed they had nothing, with the specific grace of people who had learned to be excellent in rooms that did not expect excellence from them. She knew exactly how to carry herself through this. She texted Marvella back, "Thank you, I am all right, I will be in touch soon." Simple. True. No more and no less than what was needed. She set the phone down. She picked up the pen. She continued signing. Camille drove to her grandfather's house alone. Gloria offered to come. Camille said no. This was the kind of conversation you had one person at a time. You did not bring your attorney, even if your attorney was also your sister, into a conversation with your grandfather on his porch. Some conversations were older than legal strategy and needed to be held in older air. Reginald Ernest Whitfield lived in the same house in the Cascade Heights neighborhood that he bought in 1979. When he bought it, Cascade Heights was the center of black professional Atlanta. It meant something to buy there. It announced who you were and who you intended to be. The house was not large by any measurement Broderick Kingston Graves would have found significant. It was meticulous. Every surface of it attended to, the yard precise. The porch paint refreshed every 3 years without fail. 2 chairs faced the street from that porch. They had been facing that street for 45 years. Reginald was in one of them when she pulled up. She had not told him she was coming. She had not needed to. She parked in front of the house and walked up the path, and he did not get up when she got close. His knees did not allow for quick movements anymore. But he held out his hand when she was close enough, and she took it, and she sat in the second chair, and they watched the morning light change over the street in silence. He had a glass of water with lemon on the small table between the chairs. She had her hands in her lap. Her daughter moved, a slow rolling motion, and Camille put her hand on her stomach without thinking about it. The way you put your hand on something that is yours. The neighborhood moved around them. Someone was cutting grass 2 houses down, the sound rising and falling with the geometry of the yard. A child on a bicycle, a car passing without urgency. The city bus turning the corner at the intersection and the sound of its brakes settling. She breathed it all in, this specific Atlanta, the one her grandfather made possible. The one that was the foundation of everything that came after it. The houses and the streets and the neighbors and the particular morning light of the Cascade Heights neighborhood on an October day, warm without being hot, the kind of light that made you understand why people love this city. After a while, her grandfather said, "Tell me about that audit he tried to run." She told him. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who is receiving information he expected. His attorneys were looking for the Whitfield Trust. They would not find it under that name because we restructured it in 2009 under the holding company your grandmother named. He paused. Most attorneys not specifically looking for that chain of ownership would spend 6 months and not get there. He spent 6 weeks. He gave up, she said. He thought there was nothing significant to find, her grandfather said. He looked at her sideways. He thought you were what he needed you to be, she said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want to hear the whole story? The real beginning of it?" "Yes," she said. "I want Eugenia to know the whole story, too. I want to be able to tell her everything." He turned his face back toward the street. He began. His grandfather, whose name was Earl Whitfield, had been a sharecropper in Alabama in the 1930s. He worked land he did not own for a portion of the crop he did not control. He worked it alongside his wife, a woman named Eva, who had strong opinions and stronger hands and who understood, from a very young age, that the road out of Alabama for her children was going to be built one saved dollar at a time. Eva May kept money in her shoes, not because she was careless with it, but because there was no bank in their county that would hold it safely for a black family. There was no institution that existed to preserve what they earned. So she kept it in her shoes, and she kept it in small sealed tins in the back of the kitchen cabinet, and she kept a ledger and a Bible that no one would touch because it was her Bible and it was sacred. She saved enough, over 20 years, to give her children a start. Not a large start, but a real one. Her children gave their children a slightly larger start. Reginald's father had been able to buy a small house in Birmingham. He had been able to send Reginald to college, the first in the family. Reginald had come to Atlanta in 1972 with a degree in accounting and the specific understanding built into him by 3 generations of people who had carried money in their shoes and kept it in Bibles, that wealth was not about what you had. It was about what you could protect. "Your grandmother and I argued about this once," he said. "She said it sounded like I expected every marriage to fail. I told her it was the opposite. I wanted every Whitfield woman to stay in a marriage because she wanted to, not because she had no way out." He paused. She said that was the most romantic and most practical thing she had ever heard at the same time. Camille put her head on his shoulder. He patted her hand. He told her about the 1978 brokerage account. The first one. He had walked into a downtown Atlanta brokerage office and sat down across from a white man who had looked at him with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to bother. He had placed his documents on the table and spoken in the precise language he had spent 6 years learning. And the white man, after a long moment, had decided that Reginald Ernest Whitfield was worth taking seriously. That account had grown. He had added to it and diversified it and brought in his wife as co-decision maker because she was, he said plainly, the better financial mind of the two of them, and it was not worth his pride to pretend otherwise. She had taken online finance courses at 63 years old because she wanted to understand the mechanics of what they had built together. She had sat at the kitchen table with the same laptop Camille now remembered from childhood visits, and she had worked through course material until she understood exactly what every document said and exactly what every decision meant. She built the portfolio as much as I did, he said. More in the last 15 years. I told your mother once that the Whitfield money would be Whitfield money for 3 more generations because your grandmother made sure we understood it. Not just held it, understood it. Camille breathed. She breathed the Cascade Heights morning and her grandfather's voice and the specific piece of a chair that had been waiting for her for 45 years. She breathed for herself. She breathed for Eugenia, who was going to know this story. Who was going to grow up knowing exactly who had sat in these chairs and what they had decided and why those decisions had made her possible. This is the inheritance, Camille thought. Not the money, the understanding of it. She breathed until the weight in her chest settled into something she could carry without losing her posture. Then she said, I want to build something. After this is done. Something named for Eva May. Her grandfather turned to look at her. She said, a financial literacy foundation. For young black women. HBCU partnership. Practical education. The kind of education that produces women who can sit in a boardroom and understand what every document says and every decision means. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, your grandmother would have cried. I know, Camille said. He said, that is exactly right, baby girl. That is exactly what comes next. They sat together in the October morning for 20 more minutes after that. They did not speak. The neighborhood moved around them. The child on the bicycle came back around the block. The city bus turned its corner again. Life doing what it does, which is continuing. When Camille's phone buzzed with a text from Gloria, she picked it up and read it. Gloria had forwarded a message from Amani Cross. The message said, preliminary review complete. If the Whitfield Trust is structured as described, Broderick Graves has no legal claim to any of it and potentially significant liability for the audit he commissioned without spousal notice. This is not a complicated case. It is a clarifying one. Tell your sister she is in an excellent position. Camille showed her grandfather the screen. He read it. He said, good attorneys are worth every cent you pay them. He handed the phone back. You going to need anything else before tomorrow? She thought about it. No, she said. I have everything I need. He nodded. She stood. She leaned down and kissed his cheek. His skin was warm and soft in the way of old men who have been loved well. Call me tonight, he said, whatever time it is. I will, she said. She walked back down the path to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about Eva May, a woman who kept money in her shoes because there was no institution that would protect it for her. A woman who kept a ledger in a Bible because the Bible was the one thing that would not be searched. A woman who looked at the world she had been given and decided, without being dramatic about it, that she was going to build something in it anyway. Whatever the world said about what was possible for her. She called her daughter Eugenia. She named a holding company Eva May. She started a chain that ended here, on a porch in Cascade Heights, with a great-great-granddaughter who had grown $92 million into $514 million while running a household and attending galas and making herself useful to a man who had decided she was nothing. Camille started the car. She was not nothing. She was the interest on what they saved. The morning of the first formal legal meeting, Camille woke at 5:30. She lay in her mother's guest bed and she looked at the ceiling. The room was familiar in the way of rooms you have slept in since childhood, but do not sleep in regularly. The specific ceiling of a room you know without thinking about. The crack along the left edge that had been there since 1994 and had been plastered over twice but always came back. The window that let the morning in from the east. She breathed. She thought about what she was going to walk into. She had been in many professional meetings. She had been in rooms with investors and attorneys and financial analysts and board members. She was not afraid of professional rooms. She was at ease in them in a way that had been natural since Howard. Something about the specific language of money, the way a financial argument built itself clause by clause toward an inescapable conclusion, had always felt to her like a language she was native in. Like it was the language she thought in underneath all the other languages. This was a different kind of professional room. This was a room where the financial argument was entangled with the most personal things she had, her marriage, her daughter, her name, her family's legacy. She was going to have to hold all of that together, the professional and the personal, and present herself in that room as both a woman with standing and a woman who was not going to lose her composure in the moment when composure mattered most. She got up. She made Patience coffee in her mother's kitchen. She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around the warm mug. She thought about her grandmother at 63 years old, sitting at a kitchen table with a laptop, working through finance course material because she wanted to understand what she and Reginald had built, because she did not want to hold wealth without understanding it, because understanding was the only form of ownership that could not be taken. She thought, I understand what I have. I understand all of it, and I am going to walk into that room and make that clear. She arrived at Amani Cross's building at 9:40 for a 10 o'clock meeting. The building was on Peachtree Street. The lobby was understated in the way of buildings where very serious work is done. Good materials, no excess. A receptionist who was professionally pleasant without being warm. She parked in the attached structure. She turned off the engine. She sat. She put her hands on the steering wheel. She looked at the concrete pillar in front of her car. She breathed, Lord, this is the meeting. This is the moment. She thought about what she had prepared. The ledger, the calendar documentation, the analysis of the LLC transfer dates, the recommendation documents she had generated for the 3 properties, everything organized and annotated and cross-referenced. She had prepared for this meeting the way she had prepared for every significant professional presentation in her career, thoroughly, specifically, with the full understanding that the quality of your preparation is what determines how much space you can take up in the room without performance. If you are prepared, you do not have to perform confidence. You just have the information. And the information presented clearly does the work. She said to her daughter, I am figuring it out, baby girl. You have a mother who is figuring it out. That is what you need to know. She got out of the car. She was Camille Eugenia Whitfield Graves. She had graduated magna cum laude from Howard University. She had grown a $92 million trust to $514 million. She had documentation for every decision. She walked in. Inside Amani Cross's office, the morning proceeded with a precision that matched the precision Camille brought to it. Imani was everything Gloria had described. She had the quality of total attention that the best professionals develop, the quality of being completely present in the room without any excess performance around the presence. She listened. She asked questions that were exactly the right questions. She noted things without interrupting the flow of what Camille was telling her. When Camille finished, Amani looked at the documents on the table between them. She said, I want to tell you something that I do not always say to clients, because it is not always true. Camille looked at her. Amani said, you made a fundamental strategic error when he underestimated you. Not a small error, a categorical one. She paused. He assumed that because he had more visible power, he had more actual power. He did not understand that visible power and actual power are frequently different things. And in a high-asset situation like this one, where one party has extensive undisclosed assets and the other party does not know what they do not know, the party with the information is always going to be in the stronger position. She paused again. She said, you have the information. You have always had the information. And now we have the documentation to make it legible to a court. Camille said, he thought he was the one preparing. Amani said he was. He just was not preparing for the right situation. They worked for 4 hours. When Camille walked back out to the parking structure at 2 in the afternoon, she sat in her car for 3 minutes, not because she was not ready to drive, because she needed 3 minutes to let the morning settle into her, to understand that she had just walked into the first formal meeting of the rest of her life, and she had been exactly who she needed to be in it. She breathed. Then she drove. She had somewhere to be. After the call with Shanice, Camille sat at her mother's kitchen table for 20 minutes without doing anything. She was processing. She did this differently than most people. She did not talk it through, not immediately. She did not call someone. She sat with it and she turned it over and she looked at it from every angle, the way she looked at a complex financial position, understanding the full shape of it before she decided what to do with it. The call had given her several things. It had given her additional information about how Broderick had represented her to Shanice, the curation he had performed, the specific lies he had told that were designed to make both women think they understood a situation that neither of them actually understood. That was useful. Not emotionally useful, legally useful potentially, and in terms of understanding the character of what she had been dealing with. It had also given her something she had not expected, something more complicated. She had seen in Shanice's voice the specific texture of a woman who had made decisions based on false information and who was now dealing with the consequences of those decisions. That was not an experience Camille was entirely unsympathetic to. She had made decisions based on false information too. Different false information, delivered differently, but false nonetheless. She did not forgive Shanice for what she had said in the hallway. She was not in a position to forgive it yet, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, because performing forgiveness before you actually feel it is its own kind of dishonesty. But she saw her. She saw a woman who had been given a version of a situation that was designed to serve someone else's interests and who had acted on that version in ways that she now understood were costly. She thought about this. Then she picked up her phone and she texted Amani Cross. She said, "I received a call this morning from Shanice Fontaine. She has information about the LLC structure and is willing to provide a formal statement. She will be calling your office. Please expect her." Amani's response arrived in 4 minutes. It said, "This is good news. Thank you for the heads up. I will make sure she is received professionally." Camille set the phone down. She thought about the word broke. She had been thinking about it since the night of the gala. She had turned it over in her mind many times in the past 2 weeks. She had examined it from every angle, the anger of it, the absurdity of it, the specific sting of hearing yourself described in a way that could not have been more wrong. But she was also now thinking about what it must have felt like to say it, to be so certain of a description of someone you had never met, to be so completely confident in a version of a woman that you had received secondhand, to not even know, when you said it, that you were looking at the wrong picture entirely. That was what it looked like when someone gave you a curated version of another person, and you believed it without asking questions. She had done that too, in a different way. She had believed the version of Broderick that she had decided to believe, even when things she could see should have made her ask questions. The world ran on curated versions of people. She was going to build something different. She was going to build a foundation that taught young women to look at the actual numbers, to read the actual documents, to not take anyone's word for what something was worth or what someone had, to ask the questions and read the subclauses and understand the mechanisms. No more curated versions. The truth was in the documents, and she had always read the documents. The Saturday morning after the Lavinia call, Camille went for a walk. She had not walked anywhere in 2 weeks except the distance between her mother's kitchen and her mother's guest room and occasionally her grandfather's porch. She had been stationary in the way of someone managing a crisis, rooted to the places that were safe, not going far. The Saturday morning was cool and clear. Dorothy was at the grocery store. The house was quiet. Camille put on her shoes. She walked out the front door. She turned left on her mother's street and she walked. Not fast. Her daughter was low now, 8.5 months, and fast walking was not comfortable. But steady, measured. The specific pace of a woman who has somewhere she is going, even if that somewhere is just the end of the block and back. She walked her mother's neighborhood. She passed the house where her childhood best friend had lived. The friend had moved away at 15 and they had lost touch. She passed the church her family had attended before they found New Covenant Baptist. Small and white painted with a marquee out front that said, "God is not done with you yet," which was the kind of sentiment that New Covenant would probably not put on a marquee, but that felt right for this particular morning. She walked. She thought about Lavinia. She thought about the specific courage it had taken for Lavinia to call, to be the mother of the person who had done harm and to call the person who had been harmed and to say, "I am sorry and I choose you and I should have said so sooner." That was not a small thing. That was a woman putting her love for what was right above her love for what was comfortable. And in Camille's experience, that was one of the rarer and more significant choices a person made. She thought about her own mother, about Dorothy, who had almost left a marriage and had stayed instead, who had rebuilt herself inside that marriage, and who had built a daughter who knew from childhood that you did not have to choose between your dignity and your life, that you could have both. She thought about her grandmother, who had made Patience coffee at 4 in the morning when she was working through something hard, who had kept a ledger and a Bible and a steady hand in every storm. She thought about Eva May, who she had never met, who had put the first dollar in a shoe and started everything. She walked to the end of the block. She turned around. She walked back. By the time she returned to her mother's front porch, she had walked 37 minutes. Her feet were tired. Her back was the specific kind of ache that was her constant companion now. She sat on the porch step and she breathed the Saturday morning. She was going to be fine. Not fine in the easy sense. Fine in the hard-earned sense. Fine in the sense of a woman who has walked through the hardest things she has faced and has come out the other side with a clearer picture of who she is and what she is worth and what she intends to build. She was going to be fine. She was going to build something extraordinary. She was going to tell her daughter everything. She sat on the porch step until Dorothy's car turned into the driveway, grocery bags in the back seat. She stood up and went to help her mother carry them in. The room full of women from New Covenant Baptist stayed for 3 hours. They cleaned up the kitchen after the food was eaten. They washed every dish that was in Dorothy's sink, the ones from the past few days that had accumulated in the particular way of dishes when the person who normally clears them promptly is in the middle of something else. They wiped down counters. They reorganized the refrigerator to make room for the containers of food they had brought. They did all of this without asking whether it needed doing. They could see that it needed doing, and they did it. Camille sat at the kitchen table and watched them and felt something she did not have a name for that was close to gratitude but deeper than gratitude. It was the specific feeling of being tended to without having to perform the receiving of care, of being in a room where no one needed her to be anything in particular. She was just Camille. She was Dorothy's daughter. She was the woman who had grown up in this community and who was going through something hard. That was enough. That was who they had come for. Marvella Hughes sat beside her for most of the 3 hours. Marvella did not talk much. She was one of those people who understood that presence did not require words. She kept her hand close to Camille's hand on the table, not always touching but available, the way you keep yourself available to someone who might need you without making them feel held. At one point, she said, 30 years ago, when I was going through something, and I sat in someone else's kitchen just like this. You know what the best thing was? Camille said, what? Marvella said, the food was good, but the company was better. Camille looked at her. Marvella said, the thing is, baby, you are not the first woman to sit in this chair, and you are not going to be the last. But you are surrounded by every woman who ever sat in it and got through it. You can feel that if you let yourself. Camille looked at the table, at the women moving through the kitchen, at her mother refilling glasses, at Claudette May Rivers sitting in the corner chair with her hands in her lap, steady as stone. She let herself feel it. She felt it. The long chain of women who had sat in kitchens and received food and been held by their community and gotten through it. The specific strength that was not your own strength, but the accumulated strength of everyone who had survived before you and left the knowledge of how to survive in the walls and the tables and the hands of the people who loved you. She breathed it in. She held it. She breathed it out. When Imani called that evening with the settlement terms, Camille was ready. She had spent 3 hours being held by her community, and she had arrived at the kind of clarity that comes after being held, the kind that is not about strength but about steadiness, the specific steadiness of knowing where you stand and who is standing with you. She told Imani, send it. She told Imani, 48 hours is the limit. She told Imani, we are ready for whatever he decides. Then she put the phone down and she helped her mother finish washing the last of the containers the women had left. She washed dishes at her mother's sink at 8 o'clock at night, and she was steady. She was entirely, completely, deeply steady. In the days after the settlement offer was sent, the Atlanta business community did what it always did. It talked. Not loudly. Not in press releases. In the specific quiet channels that ran beneath everything visible. In the calls between people who knew people. In the conversations at the kinds of meetings where the business of the city got discussed over meals. In the text messages between people who were watching a situation develop and who were deciding quietly and individually which way they were going to turn. Camille was aware of all of this. She had been aware of it from the moment the blog post ran. She understood how these things moved. She had spent 5 years watching Broderick manage his reputation in exactly these channels, the specific work of being seen favorably in the unofficial infrastructure of Atlanta's professional world. She also knew something about those channels that he perhaps did not fully understand. They ran both ways. The same network that had been watching Broderick Kingston Graves build his reputation for 10 years was now watching what happened when a man who built his reputation on integrity was revealed to have behaved without it. The community would not make a public statement. It would not issue a press release. It would simply turn. The turning was already happening. She could feel it in the calls she was receiving, not from people who were eager to offer information or alliance, from people who simply wanted to know how she was doing. People who had been at the galas and the events and who were now reaching out with the specific warmth of people who are recalibrating. Sterling Devereaux's call had been the clearest signal. Sterling was a man who said what he meant, who had watched her for 4 years and understood what he was seeing, and was now for the first time saying it out loud. She did not take that for granted. She understood what it represented. Sterling Devereaux saying, we saw you and you are going to be extraordinary, was not just a personal kindness. It was a reading of the room. It was a signal about which direction the serious people in Broderick's professional circle were going to turn. They were going to turn toward her. She was going to give them something worth turning toward. The foundation. The investment work. The full life she was going to build in full visibility, in her own name, in the language of her own expertise. She had spent 5 years invisible in public rooms. She was done with that. She was going to take up all the space she was entitled to. She was going to take up that space with grace and competence, and the specific kind of presence that did not need to announce itself. She picked up the Howard Journal from the nightstand. She opened it again. She found an entry she had not read the first time. From the spring of freshman year, she had written, "I want to build something, not just manage something. Build. Something that starts with my hands and my mind and that is mine from the beginning. Something that has my name on it. I do not know yet what it is, but I know it is coming." She read that entry 3 times. Then she set the journal down. She was building it. She had been building it. It had my name on it from the beginning. I just needed to say so out loud. The morning after the settlement was finalized, Camille woke before sunrise. She lay in the guest bed in her mother's house, and she understood in the specific clarity of early morning that something was different, not fixed, not healed, not resolved in any emotional sense, but different. There was a quality to the morning that had not been there yesterday, a lightness, not happiness exactly, something more fundamental. The lightness of someone who has been holding a great deal of weight for a long time and has finally been able to set some of it down. She breathed. She listened to the house. Dorothy was still asleep. The neighborhood was still asleep. It was that particular hour before dawn when even the city reduced itself to its minimum, and the quiet had the quality of something precious. Something that was not going to last, but that was fully, completely here in this moment. She breathed the quiet. She thought about all of it. The 5 years of the marriage. The 5 years of the trust management, which had run alongside the marriage and underneath it and had been, she understood now, the truest expression of who she was during those years. The legal proceedings that had just concluded. The settlement that Broderick had signed. She did not feel triumph. She felt, more than anything, clarity. Everything was clearer now than it had been for years. She knew what she had. She knew what she was. She knew what she was going to build. She got up. She made Patience coffee. She took it to the back porch, and she sat on the top step, and she drank it while the sky did its slow work of becoming morning. The black fading to deep blue fading to something lighter and more promising. The first bird sound, then the second, then the neighborhood beginning, bit by bit, to notice that it was morning. She sat and she breathed and she watched the sky. She thought about the foundation, about the name Iva May, about what it was going to mean for young women to sit in a classroom and learn about trusts and holding structures and the legal mechanisms of protecting what you build, about what it was going to mean for a young woman from Birmingham or Atlanta or Charlotte to understand at 20 years old what Camille had not fully understood until her grandfather explained it to her on a porch in Cascade Heights. She was going to give them that understanding. She was going to do for them what her grandfather had done for her, what Eva May had done, across generations, with nothing but a shoe and a Bible and a clear-eyed decision that the future deserved better than the present. The sky became morning. She was ready. Reverend Augustine Hollis arrived at Dorothy Whitfield's house at 11 in the morning. He was a man of 61, with silver at his temples and a careful way of moving that suggested he had long ago made peace with the fact that people watched pastors more closely than they watched other people. He was wearing plain clothes. Not his collar, not his Sunday presence. He had come as a man rather than as a title, which told Camille something before he said a single word. She had not expected him. She had expected Marvella Hughes, perhaps, or one of the other women from the women's circle who had already reached out. She had not expected the pastor himself driving across the city on a weekday morning to sit at her mother's kitchen table. Dorothy let him in. She set a cup of coffee in front of him. She sat down at the end of the table in the specific way of a woman who is present but not participating, available but not intrusive, giving her daughter the space to lead the conversation while making sure she was not alone in it. Reverend Hollis looked at Camille across the table. He had married them. He had stood at the front of New Covenant Baptist Church 5 years ago and spoken the words that joined her life to Broderick's life in the presence of their families and their community and their God. He had seen both of them at their most ceremonially public. He had witnessed the compact. He said, "I am not here to tell you what to do." Camille nodded. "And I am not here to protect the image of that marriage," he said. "What I am here to tell you is something I should have told someone several months ago." He told her about the conversation 3 months prior. Broderick had approached him about expanding the Graves Capital Community Foundation's partnership with New Covenant Baptist. The conversation had been generous and specific. It had included numbers that would have been significant for the church's after-school programs and its community health initiatives. It had been, Reverend Hollis said, one of the most compelling conversations he had been part of in recent memory. It had also, he now understood, been something else. He was building something around himself, the Reverend said. I understand that now. The money was real. The programs would have been real. But the timing, the specifics, the way he framed the partnership in terms of what it would say to the community about his family's commitment. He stopped. He was building a wall. Camille looked at him. He tried to use the church as a wall between him and what he had done. But the church is not his, and neither is this community. She said, Reverend, the church has been good to me. The women of New Covenant have been part of my life since I was a child. That is not something he can take? No, Reverend Hollis said. It is not. He paused. I want you to know that. The community is not his. Whatever he may have believed, the community belongs to itself. And the women who built that community, the women who have held it for 30 and 40 and 50 years, they are watching right now and they know what they see. He stayed for 40 minutes. He drank his coffee and he spoke plainly, and at the end of it he said he was sorry. Not in the easy way, in the hard way. The way of a man who understands that his silence had been a kind of complicity and who is trying to be honest about that. After he left, Dorothy stood at the kitchen window and watched his car pull away. She said, he is a good man. He did not know what he was watching. Camille said, most people did not know what they were watching. Her mother said no. They saw a devoted wife and a successful husband. They saw what you both performed. He performed it, Camille said. I was trying to have a marriage. Dorothy turned from the window. She looked at her daughter for a long moment. She said, I know, baby. The doorbell rang. Camille was not expecting anyone else. But she had been not expecting people all morning, and they kept arriving, as if the community had its own information system and its own decision-making process, and it had already decided that this was the day it was going to show up. Dorothy opened the door. Niecy Marie Holloway was standing on the porch with a blood pressure cuff slung over her shoulder, a bag from the Oxtail restaurant 3 blocks from Camille's old apartment, and the specific calm of a woman who had been trained to manage crisis without absorbing it. She was also wearing an expression that said she had driven 4 hours from Charlotte, North Carolina, without being asked, because Gloria had sent her a 3-word text that said, Camille needs you. Girl, Niecy said, looking past Dorothy at Camille, let me see your blood pressure before you say 1 word to me. Camille laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in more than 12 hours. The sound of it surprised her. It came up fast and genuine and warm. The specific laugh of a woman who remembers, in the middle of a catastrophe, that she has people. That she has people who will drive 4 hours and bring oxtail and a blood pressure cuff and stand on a porch and demand to see her numbers before they say hello. She stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the door. Niecy Holloway pulled her into a hug that smelled like her perfume and the inside of a car, and something that had always simply smelled like Niecy, clean and steady and entirely her own person. Baby pressure, and your spirit, Niecy said into her hair. We are checking all 3. Camille laughed again. They sat at the kitchen table together while Niecy took her blood pressure and asked her clinical questions in the warm, direct way of a pediatrician who holds your hand while telling you the hard truth. The numbers were acceptable. Not perfect, but acceptable. Niecy told her to drink more water and to stop spending long periods on her feet. I am currently sitting, Camille pointed out. Good, Niecy said. Keep doing that. They ate the oxtail. Dorothy made rice. Niecy pulled up a playlist on her phone that was the specific playlist she made for hard days. The one she had been making and adding to since their freshman year at Howard, slow and warm and full of songs that did not require anything from the listener except to be present. They did not talk about the legal situation. They did not talk about Broderick. They talked about Niecy's patients and a funny story from her hospital last week, and about the color Niecy had painted the room she was preparing for the baby's first visit, which was a very specific shade of sage green that Camille had actually picked out from a paint chip she sent to Niecy 8 months ago. They talked about small things. They let the small things do the work that small things do, which is to make the room feel like a room again and not like a courtroom. At 2 in the afternoon, Camille's phone buzzed with a notification. She looked at the screen. She was not expecting legal communication today. Imani Cross was still reviewing the documents. The formal meeting was not until tomorrow morning. There was no reason for anything official to be arriving yet. But Broderick's attorneys worked fast when they were scared, and they were clearly scared. The notification was an email, forwarded from the Buckhead address, where mail was apparently still arriving in her name. A formal legal communication from a firm she recognized as one of the highest billed practices in Atlanta, advising her of Broderick's intent to seek documentation of any assets held in her name or held in trust for her benefit, as part of preliminary divorce proceedings. He was filing first. He thought if he filed first, he would have some kind of positioning advantage. He did not understand and would not understand until Imani Cross filed her response, that there was no amount of first filing that was going to change the fundamental shape of what Camille held and what he did not. She showed the email to Gloria. Gloria read it. She picked up her phone and called Imani Cross. She said his attorneys just moved. We need to accelerate our timeline. She listened. She said, good. Tomorrow morning, first thing. She listened again. She said 3 words. She said, let them come. She put the phone down. She looked at her sister. She said, Imani says this is good. This is exactly what we needed. His attorneys moving early gives us more to work with, not less. Nisi was looking at Camille across the table. She said, how are you feeling, actually? Camille thought about it honestly. Tired, she said, and ready. Both of those things at the same time. Nisi said, that is exactly right. That is exactly where you should be. The baby moved. Camille put her hand on her stomach. She thought about how Eugenia was going to know this story someday. Not the hurt of it, the architecture of it. The specific fact that her mother had sat in her grandmother's kitchen with her best friend and her sister and eaten oxtail and laughed and taken a blood pressure check and made a plan and felt, through all of it, entirely accompanied. Held by a community that had decided, before it even knew the full scope of what was happening, to turn toward her. That was what she was going to give Eugenia. Not just the money, not just the assets and the structure and the legal protection. She was going to give her this. The knowledge that you could face the hardest thing of your life and be accompanied through it. That the community you had shown up for would show up for you. That the women in your life would drive 4 hours and bring oxtail and take your blood pressure and tell you the truth in the same breath. That was the real inheritance. She breathed. She was ready. Imani Cross walked into the meeting room the following morning with the specific energy of someone who has been waiting a long time to work on something exactly like this. She was 42 years old, with 20 years of high-asset divorce proceedings behind her and an office on Peachtree Street that was deliberately and intentionally intimidating in its understatement. Good furniture, very few decorations. The kind of room that communicated, without saying it, that the woman who worked in it had nothing to prove and no time to perform. She set her legal pad on the table. She looked at Camille across the polished surface. She said, before we begin, I want to be clear about one thing. I have been doing this for 20 years. I have seen some extraordinary situations. What you have brought me is, in my professional opinion, one of the most completely clarifying cases I have encountered. She paused. He thought he was preparing for a fight. He was actually preparing his opponent. Camille said, I know. Good, Imani said. Now tell me everything. Camille told her everything. She told her about the folder in Broderick's desk, the unauthorized audit, the secondary LLC, under Shanice's middle name, the 3 properties and the redirected funds and the restructuring agreement she had signed without reading the subclauses fully. She showed Imani the documents, every page of the ledger, every calendar notation, every piece of the picture she had been building since 2 in the morning 2 days ago. Imani took notes with the speed of someone who has long since taught her hand to keep up with her mind. When Camille finished, Imani set down her pen. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to explain to you, in plain language, what the Whitfield Trust structure means legally in the state of Georgia, and then I want to explain to you what the LC means legally, and then I want to explain to you why we are going to file the most beautiful response to his attorney's motion that anyone in this city has read in recent memory, she explained. Camille listened with the full attention she had developed at Howard. The kind of attention that is not just hearing but mapping. You build the structure of the argument as you listen to it. You note the load-bearing elements. You note where the foundations are solid and where they might need reinforcement. The foundations in this case were solid. The Whitfield Family Trust had been restructured in 2009 under Eva May Holdings Incorporated. This restructuring had taken place 8 years before the marriage and had been structured, with complete legal precision, in a way that placed the assets outside the definition of marital property under Georgia law. The assets had not been commingled with marital assets at any point. The management fees Camille received for managing the trust had been paid into a separate personal account that predated the marriage and had remained separate throughout it. He had no legal claim to any of it. The unauthorized audit, on the other hand, was a different matter. It was not criminal, but it was legally significant. It demonstrated intent. It demonstrated that Broderick had been, prior to any formal divorce filing, conducting financial inquiries into his wife's separate assets without her knowledge or consent. Amani said this was a document that would be very useful in establishing the character of the situation for any judge who ended up looking at it. The secondary LLC was more complicated and more useful. Camille's co-signature on the original business accounts prior to the restructuring meant that transfers from those accounts during the period of her co-signatory authority required her consent for certain transactions. Imani's review of the transfer dates against the dates of the LLC activity suggested that some of the fund movements may have occurred in a window that created legal exposure for Broderick. She was going to have her forensic accounting team review it specifically. He was in a hurry, Imani said. People who in a hurry make mistakes. She filed the response 2 days later. Gloria called Camille when it was done and read several paragraphs from it over the phone, and Camille sat on the edge of her mother's guest bed and listened to her sister read the legal language that had been built from her own records, her own calendar, her own careful documentation. And she felt something move through her that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but something close to both. The specific feeling of watching something that had been invisible for a long time become visible, become documented, become real in a way that could not be argued with. On the afternoon that Broderick's attorneys received Imani's response, there was a silence on their end that Gloria later described as the sound of very expensive professionals recalculating. And then, 2 days after the legal filing, a financial blog that was read closely in Atlanta business circles ran a piece with an anonymous tip. It described, in general terms, a significant legal dispute within the founding family structure of a prominent black-owned private equity firm. It did not name Shanice Fontaine. It did not name the trust, but it named Broderick, and it named Camille. By 3 in the afternoon, 12 people had texted Camille to ask if she was all right. The story was moving through the community faster than any formal announcement. This was how these things moved. Not through press releases. Through the specific informal infrastructure of people who knew people who knew people. The same infrastructure that had been carrying information through Black Atlanta since long before anyone had the word social network to describe it. Broderick called her that evening. She looked at his name on the screen. She texted back, "My attorney will be in touch with yours. I am not available for personal calls at this time." He called again. She put the phone in her purse. He thought this was a personal crisis. He still thought on some level that this was going to resolve itself through a conversation. Through whatever version of that conversation he had been scripting in his head for the past 3 days, the one where he explained and she heard his explanation and they found a way to manage the situation. He did not understand yet that she was not managing a situation. She was building a case. There was a parking lot attached to Imani Cross's office building. Camille had parked there for their first formal meeting. She had sat in her car in that parking lot for 8 minutes before she could make herself go in. Not because she was afraid, because she was looking for something inside herself that she had not needed before. The version of herself who walked into legal battles, who sat across tables from adversarial attorneys and held her own ground, who understood that she was not the supporting character in this story, not the woman who needed to be protected or managed or guided through a process, but the principal, the one the entire architecture was built around. She had sat with her hands on the steering wheel and she had talked to the baby, quietly, without performing anything. She said, "I am figuring it out, baby girl. You have a mother who is figuring it out. That is what you need to know." Then she had gotten out of the car. He audited me because he was scared. He did not find anything because he did not know what he was looking for. I knew exactly what I was building, and I built it anyway in 5 years of silence. In 5 years of galas and dinners and meetings where I was decorative and invisible, I knew exactly what I was building. She got out of the car. She walked in. She introduced herself as Camille Eugenia Whitfield Graves, and she sat down at the table and she explained, in precise and unhurried language, exactly what she had and exactly how it was documented and exactly what she intended to do next. And Imani Cross, 20-year veteran of high-asset divorce proceedings, had looked at her across the table with the expression of a woman who had finally found a case she was excited to work on. "Well then," Imani had said, "let us get to work." Shanice Fontaine called Camille on a Tuesday. It was 2 weeks after the gala, 6 days after the legal filing. Camille was in her mother's kitchen at 9 in the morning, drinking coffee and reviewing a document Imani had sent over the night before, when her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She almost did not answer. She had been letting unknown numbers go to voicemail since the blog post ran. There had been 3 journalists, 2 people she thought might be gathering information for Broderick, and 1 woman from a financial magazine who left a thoughtful message that Camille had saved but not yet returned. She answered on the 4th ring. "I know you do not have any reason to take this call," a voice said. Camille knew the voice immediately. She set down her coffee, she said. Then give me one. A pause. Shanice Fontaine said, I have been trying to figure out how to make this call for 6 days. I do not know the right way to do it. I am just going to tell you what I know, and you can decide what to do with it. Camille was quiet. She was listening. Not to be polite, because she understood that what Shanice said in the next few minutes was going to be important, and she wanted to hear all of it. Shanice told her. It came out in a careful and organized way that told Camille that Shanice had been preparing this speech. She was not an impulsive woman. She had thought about what to say, and she had decided to say it plainly. Shanice said that she had believed for 18 months that Broderick's marriage was a formality, an arrangement, something that existed on paper and in public and that had no particular life inside it. Broderick had described his wife to her in specific terms: content, financially dependent, uninterested in the business side of their life together. He had said more than once that Camille was comfortable, that she had what she needed and wanted no more than that. He made me think, Shanice said, that I knew you, that I understood what your life was. He described you to me like you were a background character in his story, like you were there but not really present in your own life. She paused. She said, he did the same thing to me. Camille said, what do you mean? Shanice told her about the business models. 4 of them, developed independently over 18 months, presented to Broderick as recommendations. He had implemented 3 without crediting her publicly or internally. The 4th, the one involving the secondary LLC and the 3 properties, had been structured using her name in ways she had not fully understood when she signed the documents. He told me they were standard real estate holding agreements, Shanice said. He told me that having my name on the structure was a formality that reduced his personal tax exposure. I did not read them carefully. I trusted him. Her voice was even, not defensive. Just flat, with the specific flatness of someone who has finished being ashamed and has moved into something more useful. She said, I found out last week from an attorney I consulted for an unrelated matter that my name is attached to a structure that could expose me to liability for financial decisions I did not make and did not authorize. The kitchen was quiet around Camille. She thought she knew me because he described me to her. He described the version of me he needed her to believe in. Neither one of them ever thought to ask who I actually was. She let the silence sit between them for a long moment. Then she said, are you calling me because you want help or because you want to apologize? A pause. Shanice said both. Another pause. Longer. Camille said, the apology I will think about. The help, call Amani Cross. She is my attorney. Tell her what you told me. Tell her everything. She paused. If you're willing to give a formal statement about the LL.C., it adds a dimension to this case that is going to be very useful to establishing what he did and how he did it. She paused once more. She said, and Shanice, do not ever call another woman broke again. You do not know what you are looking at. She ended the call. She set the phone down on the kitchen table. She sat with it. She sat with the complexity of what she had just heard. She had expected, if Shanice ever reached out, to feel anger. She felt some of that. But she felt also something she had not expected, which was a kind of recognition. Not sympathy, exactly. Recognition. The recognition of a woman who had been given a curated version of a man and who had acted on that curation and who was now dealing with the gap between the version she had been given and the man who actually existed. Shanice had not known what she was dealing with. She had trusted what she was told. That did not excuse what she said in the hallway. It did not make her blameless in what had happened, but it made her a more complete person than Camille had been giving her credit for being. He was skilled at giving people curated versions of reality. He had given Camille a curated version too, in a different direction. She was sitting with this thought when the doorbell rang. Dorothy opened it and came immediately back to the kitchen doorway. She said quietly, Camille. Her voice had a texture in it. Careful, controlled. The texture of a woman who is managing her own response to something so that her daughter can manage hers. Camille stood. Broderick was at the door, in person, without calling, without texting. He had driven across the city to the house where his wife had grown up, and he had rung the bell and stood on the porch like a man who had run out of options and had decided that presence was the remaining strategy. Dorothy went back to the door. Camille stayed in the kitchen. She heard her mother's voice, measured and clear. Dorothy said, Broderick, she does not want to see you. He said, Dorothy, please. Just 5 minutes. Dorothy said, I am going to ask you to leave this porch. If you come back without calling first, I am going to ask Reverend Hollis to come have a conversation with you about what a man of God does when he finds himself on the wrong side of a situation. And then I am going to call your mother and ask Lavinia if she raised you to show up uninvited at a pregnant woman's family home. A pause. You go on now. Then the sound of footsteps on the porch, down the steps. A car door. An engine. Dorothy came back to the kitchen. She sat down across from her daughter. She said he looked scared. Camille said he should be. Dorothy nodded. Twice slow. She said, good, they ate lunch. They talked about practical things. They talked about the baby's room at Camille's apartment, the one she had begun setting up before the gala and had not thought about since. Nisi had a key and could check on it. Gloria had offered to move a few things around if Camille needed her to. In the evening, after the dishes were done and Dorothy was settled on the couch with her book, Camille asked her mother if she would braid her hair. It was not something she had asked for in years. She had been managing her own hair in the way that adult women manage their own hair, efficiently and with reasonable competence, fitting it into the space around everything else that needed to be managed. But tonight she wanted to sit on the floor in front of the couch and lean back against her mother's knees the way she had as a girl and let someone else hold her head for an hour. Dorothy put down her book. She got the comb and the oil and her reading glasses and she began. They did not talk about Broderick. They talked about Howard. About the first time Camille had called home from her dorm room in freshman year, scared she had made a wrong choice about her major. About the professor who had told her she was overthinking the portfolio analysis and she had gone home and cried and then come back the next day and shown the professor exactly where his own analysis was wrong. About the night before graduation when Dorothy had driven up from Atlanta and they had sat together at a diner near campus at midnight eating pancakes. Dorothy worked through Camille's hair slowly and carefully. She said, "You never make mistakes about what you are good at. You just sometimes make mistakes about who you share it with." Camille looked at the far wall of the living room. She said, "Mama." Dorothy said, She said, "I am going to be all right." Dorothy said, without stopping the combing, "I know you are, baby. I have always known that." The call came on a Sunday afternoon. Camille was sitting in her mother's kitchen reviewing the latest documents from Amani's team. Her reading glasses were on. She had a cup of tea going cold beside her laptop. The house was quiet. Dorothy had gone to a church committee meeting. Nisi had driven back to Charlotte the day before. Gloria was in Birmingham managing her own caseload while staying in close phone contact. Camille had spent the morning in a state she had not been in for weeks. Still, not the stillness of shock or the stillness of grief. The stillness of a woman who has moved through the hardest part and is now in the work. The practical, documented, decided part. She answered the phone without looking at the number. She had been doing that less since the blog post. But today she answered. The voice said, "Camille, it is Lavinia." Camille took off her reading glasses. She set them on the table. Lavinia Graves, Broderick's mother, 64 years old. A church elder at her own congregation in Decatur. A woman who had sat in the front pew at their wedding and cried through the vows. A woman who had called Camille daughter without hesitation from the second year of the marriage. A woman whose son Camille had assumed was her primary loyalty in this situation, which was a reasonable assumption to make and apparently an incorrect one. Camille said, "Lavinia." Lavinia said, "I am not calling to take sides." She paused. Then she said, "Actually, that is not true. I am calling to tell you some things that I have wanted to say for a while." Camille was quiet. She was listening. Lavinia said, "I raised that boy. I know exactly what he is capable of and what he is not capable of. What he is not capable of, and has never been capable of, is seeing the whole of a person who is standing next to him. He only ever sees what is useful." She paused again. "I saw him stop seeing you about 2 years ago," she said. "Not the public you, the real you. I sat across from you at dinner, and I could see that something was wrong, and I did not say anything because I told myself it was not my business, that it was between the two of you." Her voice caught. "Just slightly. I know now that was not the right decision." Camille said gently, "Lavinia, you did not have to know what you were watching." Lavinia said, "I should have looked harder." They were quiet together for a moment. Then Lavinia told her that she had already spoken with her son. She had gone to his apartment, not his office but his apartment, and she had sat across from him at his own kitchen table, and she had told him 3 things. The first thing was that he should not fight this in a way that humiliated Camille, that the community would not forgive him for it, and that he would need the community for the rest of his professional life, whether he understood that yet or not. The second thing was that the child Camille was carrying was a Graves by blood and a Whitfield by legacy, and that child deserved to be brought into a world that was not already defined by legal warfare. The third thing was that if he chose to go to court and attempt to claim any portion of the Whitfield trust, she would testify as a witness to the character of the marriage, in a way that would not be helpful to his case. Camille was quiet for a long time after this. Then she said, "Lavinia, thank you." Lavinia said, "I am not doing it for him. I am doing it because you have been my daughter-in-law for 5 years, and you deserved better than what you received. and I should have said so sooner. Her voice broke, just slightly, on that last sentence. She said, I am so sorry, baby. I am so sorry I did not say so sooner. Camille sat with the phone pressed against her ear, and she looked at the afternoon light coming through her mother's kitchen window, and she breathed. The people who watched my marriage and said nothing, they have to live with that silence the same way I lived inside it. That is not my burden anymore. I am putting it down, she said, Lavinia. I am not angry at you. I want you to know that. A pause. Lavinia said, that is generous. Camille said, it is true. After the call ended, she sat at the kitchen table and she let the quiet be full around her. She breathed. She thought about all the people who had seen her marriage from the outside and had made calculations about what they were seeing and had stayed in those calculations rather than asking if they were correct. That was not a burden she was willing to carry anymore. She picked up her phone. She opened the portfolio application. She had not opened it in 3 weeks. She had not been able to. The mental space that managing the portfolio required had been entirely occupied by everything else that needed to occupy it. But sitting in her mother's quiet kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, she realized she was ready. She opened the quarterly report. She read it all the way through. Then she opened the notes she had made 4 months ago about 3 potential investments she had been sitting on. Before the gala. Before everything. She had been doing preliminary research and had not made the decisions yet because she had been too consumed with managing the public presentation of a marriage that was quietly ending without her knowledge. She read the notes. She made a call to her grandfather's financial attorney. The attorney answered on the second ring. His name was Henderson Wallace, and he had been her grandfather's attorney for 22 years and had been Camille's attorney in the management of the trust since 2021. He knew her voice and he knew her work, and he treated her with the specific regard of a professional who recognizes competence in another professional. She said, Henderson, I want to talk through 3 investment positions. I have been sitting on them, and I think it is time to move. He said, give me everything you have. She gave him the analysis, methodically, the way she had been trained. Start with the data and build the picture. He listened and asked clarifying questions, and the conversation lasted 40 minutes, and at the end of it they had made 2 decisions and had agreed to revisit the third after additional review. She put the phone down. She felt herself. She felt the specific shape of herself, the one that existed outside of the marriage, outside of the gala circuit, outside of the careful performance of devotion she had sustained for 5 years. She felt the version of herself who had graduated magna cum laude from Howard and had sat down at a conference table and told Henderson Wallace what to do with $92 million and had been right about it. She called her grandfather. He picked up on the first ring. She told him what she had decided. He said, you sound like yourself again. She said, I am myself again. I think I forgot that was allowed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, it was always allowed, baby girl. It was always allowed. 3 days later, Gloria called with news. Warren Darnell Price, Broderick's chief financial officer, had filed a confidential disclosure with his own attorney. The disclosure documented everything Warren knew about the secondary LLC structure, the redirected funds, and the unauthorized audit of the Whitfield Trust. His attorney had contacted Amani Cross within 24 hours. Warren was prepared to cooperate. Gloria said, Amani says it is. I cannot quote her directly, but she is very pleased. Camille said, I always liked Warren. Gloria said, you liked him because he has a conscience. Camille said, that is usually why I like people. She thought about Warren sitting in his car in the parking structure for 11 minutes after the gala, making a call to his wife. Deciding to do the right thing before the right thing became unavoidable. That was not nothing. That was a man choosing in a specific and costly moment, to be honest. She hoped genuinely that it cost him less than he feared. 3 weeks after the gala, the doorbell rang at Dorothy's house at 10 in the morning. Camille was at the kitchen table. She had her laptop open and a legal document on her left and a glass of water she was trying to remember to drink on her right. She had been sleeping better. Not perfectly, but better. The specific exhaustion of shock had lifted, and what she was left with was a different kind of tired, the sustained tiredness of a woman doing serious work, which was a tiredness she understood how to inhabit. Dorothy opened the door. Camille heard her mother's voice change, the quality of warmth that moved into it, the particular warmth of a woman whose people had arrived. She heard a small crowd on the porch. She heard food containers. She stood up slowly, one hand on the table, and walked to the kitchen doorway. Marvella Hughes was at the front of the group. She was wearing her good coat and carrying a ceramic dish covered in foil. Behind her were 7 women from New Covenant Baptist Women's Circle. Some Camille knew from childhood, some she had met at church events in the years of her marriage. All of them were carrying something, a container, a bag, a casserole dish, a pie. They came in quietly. They filled Dorothy's kitchen with warmth and the particular smell of a community feeding one of its own. Fried chicken and sweet potato casserole and collard greens and 3 different desserts and a casserole of macaroni and cheese that had a specific smell that Camille recognized from decades of church potlucks, and that, immediately, powerfully, made her feel like herself. They set the food on every available surface. They did not ask for anything. They did not ask for details. They did not offer opinions about what Camille should or should not do. They brought food and presents and the specific understanding that is passed between Black women without language. The understanding that said, you do not have to explain yourself to us. You do not have to perform strength or gratitude or composure. We are just here. That is all. Marvella sat down beside Camille at the kitchen table. She said, you do not have to say a word. We are just here. Camille said, thank you. That was all she said for 20 minutes. She sat in the warm kitchen full of women who had known her mother for 30 years and who had known her for all the years of her life that she had spent at New Covenant, and she let them be there. She let the food and the warmth and the quiet movement of women who knew what they were doing fill the room. She did not have to manage this. She did not have to be gracious in the professional sense, the gala sense, the sense of being visibly appropriate at someone else's event. She could just be there. There was a woman in the corner of the kitchen who had been standing quietly since the group arrived. Camille did not know her initially, but she recognized her when she looked closely. Claudette May Rivers, 81 years old. She had been a member of New Covenant Baptist for 60 years. She was a small woman with the specific posture of someone who had learned over a very long time to take up exactly as much space as she needed and no more or less. Claudette moved to the chair beside Camille. She sat down. She took Camille's hand in both of hers. Her hands were warm and dry and steady, the hands of a woman who had been steady for 8 decades. She said, I left a man once. A long time ago. People thought I was crazy. People said I was wrong. Camille looked at her. Claudette said, those same people asked me to help them leave 10 years later. Do you know what I told them? Camille shook her head. Claudette said, I told them you know your own truth. You always did. You just needed to trust it. She patted Camille's hand once. Then she let go and sat back and said nothing else. She did not need to say anything else. Camille sat in the kitchen and breathed. She breathed among the women. She breathed in the smell of their food and their presence, and the specific sound of a room full of women who know how to be quiet in a useful way, which is a skill that takes years to develop and that this room was full of. She thought about Eugenia. She thought about her daughter growing up in a community that did this, that moved toward its people without being asked, that brought food and showed up and held hands without making it a performance. She wanted Eugenia to grow up knowing this was available to her, knowing that the women in her family's community would show up, that she was not going to navigate the hardest things of her life alone. That was what you gave your daughter. Not just the money, not just the financial architecture, the community, the knowledge that you were held. That evening, Amani Cross called. Camille took the call in the guest room. She sat on the edge of the bed with the phone against her ear and the sounds of the kitchen still audible from the hallway. Women cleaning up, the soft percussion of containers being closed and dishes being washed. The murmur of conversation. Amani said, with Warren Price's disclosure and Shanice Fontaine's statement, we are in a position to present Broderick with a settlement offer. Camille said, tell me. Amani laid it out. Full release of any claim against the Whitfield Trust or Eva May Holdings Incorporated. 40% of the marital assets, which Amani's team had independently valued at $62 million. Primary custody of Eugenia, with Broderick's visitation rights specific and enforceable. Monthly support through Eugenia's 22nd birthday. A full non-disparagement agreement preventing any public statement about Camille or the Whitfield family's finances. His attorneys will have 48 hours to respond, Amani said. Camille was quiet for a moment. She said, is that what I deserve? Amani said, it is what the law says you are entitled to, which is a different question. I know, Camille said. I have learned to work with the one that can be enforced. She heard Amani's very brief, very satisfied sound. We send it tomorrow morning, Camille said. First thing, Amani confirmed. Camille put the phone down. She sat on the edge of the guest bed in her mother's house. I am not asking for what I deserve. I am asking for what the law says I am entitled to. Those two numbers are different. I have learned to work with the one that can be enforced. She thought about her grandfather, about the specific patience that had built everything she had, the patience that understood that the goal was not to win every argument. The goal was to build something that outlasted the argument, something documented and structured and legally sound enough that no amount of argument could undo it. She thought about Iva May, who kept money in her shoes because there was no institution that would protect it, who kept a ledger and a Bible because the Bible was the one thing that would not be searched, who understood, without anyone telling her, that survival required patience and documentation, and the specific refusal to let the world's assessment of what you deserve determine what you actually built. She was her great-great-grandmother's work, and she was ready. Broderick did not wait 48 hours. He answered in 31. His attorney called Amani Cross at 11 in the morning on the day after the settlement offer was delivered. Gloria was in Dorothy's kitchen when the call came through. She had the phone on speaker. Camille was not in the room. She was on the back porch. Dorothy had built a small garden in the backyard over 30 years, and it was October bare now, but it still had the particular dignity of a garden that is resting rather than finished. Camille sat in the porch chair her mother kept there year-round, and she listened to the neighborhood's sounds, and she breathed. Gloria appeared at the back door. She said they called. Camille turned. Gloria's face was doing something specific. It was managing something. Managing the professional expression that she needed to wear, and also the other expression underneath it, the one that was her actual feeling about what she had just heard. She said, he countered. Camille said, with what? Gloria said, 15% of marital assets, no acknowledgement of the LLC, and she paused. A clause that would prevent you from discussing the financial circumstances of the marriage with any third party for 15 years. Camille looked at her sister for a long moment. She said, he still thinks this is about what I need from him. Gloria said, he has not understood yet that you do not need anything from him. She said, what did Amani say? Gloria smiled. The managing expression fell away and the other one came through. She read it over the phone to me in a tone I can only describe as delighted. Camille said, tell her to file the response. Gloria said, it has already been filed. 4 words. We will see you in discovery. Broderick's attorneys called back within 3 hours. This was the moment when he began to understand. It was not the 4 words, though those were effective. It was what came attached to them. The brief that Amani had prepared. Redacted where necessary, specific where it counted. Warren Darnell Price's disclosure, referenced carefully and precisely. Shanice Fontaine's statement, characterizing in direct language the way Broderick had described his wife to a woman he was romantically involved with, and the financial arrangements made under Shanice's name without her full legal understanding. And the unauthorized audit of the Whitfield Trust, characterized as an early indicator of intent that Broderick's own attorneys, reviewing it now, had to acknowledge was a significant document to have in the record. The Graves Capital Board was informed through a routine investor relations communication that the chief executive was involved in divorce proceedings that might affect certain disclosed asset structures. 3 board members called Broderick directly that day. He did not have good answers for any of them. The 4th board member who called that day did not call Broderick. He called Camille. Sterling Devereaux was 52 years old. He had been on the Graves Capital Board for 4 years. He had built his own family's investment firm over 20 years, and was the kind of man who had learned to read situations clearly and preferred honesty over comfort, which was not a common combination in his professional world. He had sat across dinner tables from Camille at 12 different events over 4 years. He had watched her work a room. He had watched her navigate conversations about business and community and finance with a precision and warmth that he had noticed and noted, and never found a natural occasion to say anything about because, as he said, it was not his place. He said, I am not calling as a board member. I want to be clear about that. I am calling as someone who has watched you for 4 years and understood something that apparently not enough people said out loud. Camille said, Sterling. He said, you ran circles around every person at every table at every event, quietly and completely, and everyone was looking at Broderick. He paused. We saw it. Those of us who were paying attention. We just did not say it because it was not our conversation to have. Camille said, I know. He said, you are going to be extraordinary, on your own terms, and we are going to watch that happen. Another pause. I wanted you to know that someone was watching who understood what they were seeing. She thanked him. She meant it. After the call, she sat for a while. She thought about all the rooms she had been in where she had made herself smaller and more accommodating and more decorative than she actually was, so that Broderick could be the largest presence. She had done it with love, in the beginning. She had done it with genuine desire for his success, the specific desire of a woman who had chosen someone and had committed to that choice entirely. She had also done it because it was the path of least resistance, because making herself the center of a room created friction she did not always have the energy for. Because her grandmother had told her once that a truly confident woman could afford to let someone else lead, and she had taken that lesson and applied it in ways her grandmother had not intended. She went to the guest room at the end of the hall. She went to the closet where she had put the bag she had packed in the dark of the Buckhead house 3 weeks ago. She had not unpacked it entirely. She had taken out the clothes and the vitamins and the charger. But at the bottom of the bag was a book she had not taken out. A small journal with a blue cover, worn at the corners. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. It was from her freshman year at Howard. The handwriting was rounder than her current handwriting. Less efficient. The handwriting of someone who had not yet learned to write fast because she had places to be and documents to sign. She read one entry about a finance professor who had said something encouraging and how she had gone back to her dorm and written down exactly what she was going to do with her career. Not vague. Specific. The industries she wanted to understand. The structures she wanted to build. The kind of investor she intended to become. She read a second entry about calling home because she was scared about a test, and her grandfather had told her that fear is just knowledge reminding you that something matters and that you should use the fear to study more and worry less. She closed the journal. She sat with it in her lap. The woman writing those entries had been so sure of herself, so unconcerned with managing anyone else's impression of her, so completely inhabiting her own plans for her own life. She had known exactly who she was and exactly where she was going, and she had not needed anyone's permission for any of it. That woman was still here. She had not gone anywhere. She had just spent 5 years not being given the room she needed to occupy herself in. Camille set the journal on the nightstand. She was going back. The labor lasted 16 hours. Camille had been prepared for this. Nisi had told her, clinically and warmly, that first births were often long, and that long did not mean wrong. It meant the body doing a thorough and comprehensive job. It meant making sure everything was exactly right before it let the most important thing happen. She had understood that intellectually. Understanding something intellectually and living it were different experiences. Dorothy stayed on her left through most of it. She held Camille's hand or stroked her hair or simply stood close, her presence a warmth that did not require any specific action. She had been in this room, in the metaphorical sense, many times. She understood what her daughter needed, and she provided it without being asked. Gloria paced. She was a pacer. She could not help it. She stood by the window for a while, and then she walked to the door and back, and then she stood by the window again. She was managing her own feelings about watching her sister go through something hard, and she was managing them by staying in motion. Nisi was the still center of the room. She moved when she needed to move, precisely and without waste. And she was still when she needed to be still, and she talked Camille through each contraction with the specific combination of warmth and clinical accuracy that was entirely her own. She said things like, "This one is going to be longer, but you are through the middle of it." She said things like, "Breathe through the bottom of your lungs. Give me the deep breath." Camille breathed. She breathed the way her grandmother had taught her, down to the roots. At one point, in the deepest hour of the night, when the contractions were close and long, and the work of it was the most consuming thing she had ever done, she thought about Eva May. She thought about Eva May having her children on a sharecropper's farm in Alabama, with whatever help was available, with whatever her community could provide, with her husband and perhaps a midwife and her own body doing what it knew how to do. She thought, she did this. She did this, and she kept the ledger in the Bible, and she put the money in the shoe, and she kept building for her children. Through everything, in spite of everything, she breathed. She breathed for Eva May. She breathed for her grandmother. She breathed for every woman in her family who had brought a child into the world and continued building the future for that child even when the world said they should not be able to. She breathed for Eugenia. At 7:43 in the morning, Eugenia arrived. In the quiet after, when the room settled and the monitors hummed and everyone had a moment to breathe, Dorothy came to the side of the bed and she looked at her granddaughter, and she did something she rarely did. She cried. Not a lot, not in the dramatic sense, 2 tears. Very precise. One from each eye. The specific tears of a woman who has been holding everything for a very long time and has seen something so beautiful that she can no longer hold all of it. She touched Eugenia's hand with one finger. She said, "Hello, baby girl." Eugenia did not respond to this greeting. She had opinions about other things, but she turned her face very slightly toward the warmth of the hand near her, as if she knew, already, that warmth was the direction to turn. Camille watched her mother touch her daughter's hand. She thought, this is the moment, this specific connection. 4 generations of Whitfield women in one hospital room. Dorothy, who raised me who grew the trust, Eugenia, who is going to know everything. She thought, Iva May would have loved this morning. When Broderick arrived at 9, he was quieter than she had ever seen him. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before he came into the room, and she understood from the quality of his stillness that he had spent some time preparing himself to be present in a way that was not about him. She appreciated that. She was not going to tell him she appreciated it, but she noted it. He said she is beautiful. She said she is. She watched him hold his daughter. He held her like something precious that he was not sure he had the right to hold, carefully, with a reverence that she had not seen in him often, the reverence of someone who understands in the presence of a very new person, that they are in the presence of something they did not make and cannot control and must simply receive. He held Eugenia for 20 minutes. He looked at her face, at the dark eyes which had opened briefly and were now closed, at the small, determined mouth, at the hands. He said, without looking up, she has your hands. Camille said, she has my grandmother's hands. He handed the baby back. He stood up. He looked at Camille one more time. He said, I hope you know that I am going to be here, for her. Whatever else, I am going to be here. She said, I know you are. He left. The room was quieter after he left. Not emptier, just quieter. The way a room gets when something that had weight in it is no longer there, and the room adjusts to its own true volume. Dorothy came back to sit beside the bed. She said he was sorry. Camille said, I know. Dorothy said, that is not enough. Camille said, I know that too. Dorothy said, but it is something. Camille said, yes, it is something. She looked at Eugenia. He will be her father. He will not be her story. The story is mine to tell, and I am going to tell it right. The Atlanta Business Chronicle interview happened 6 weeks after the foundation was approved. The magazine was not the Atlanta Business Chronicle, actually. It was a quarterly publication focused specifically on Black women in finance. They had reached out through a contact of Sterling Devereaux's. The editor was a woman named Josephine, who had been building the publication for 7 years and who was, by every account, deeply serious about the journalism she was doing. Camille had sat with the interview request for 4 days before she agreed to it. She thought about what she wanted to say, what she was willing to say, what serving the purpose of the story required, and what serving her own dignity required, and whether those two things could be done in the same conversation. She had concluded that they could. She agreed to one interview. One, not because she was not going to be public about what she was building. She was going to be very public about what she was building. But there was a specific and important distinction between being public about the work and being public about the personal. She was going to be public about the work. The interview was in person. In the boardroom of Eva May Holdings, Eugenia was in the office with Henderson Wallace's assistant, who had a child of her own and who had offered with genuine warmth and who Camille had trusted immediately. Josephine was a careful interviewer. She asked questions that were specific and that assumed intelligence in the person she was talking to. She did not ask about the marriage. She had been told, before the interview, that the personal aspects of the past year were not part of the conversation, and she honored that without comment or pushback. She asked about the trust. She asked about the history of the Whitfield family's financial architecture. She asked about Iva May. Camille told her about Iva May, about the shoes and the Bible and the ledger and the chain that led from a sharecropper's farm in Alabama to a boardroom on Peachtree Street in Atlanta. She told her about her grandfather's brokerage account in 1978 and her grandmother's online finance courses at 63. She told her about the specific lesson that each generation had learned and passed forward. Josephine listened with her entire body. At the end of the interview, she asked, how would I describe the past year of your life? Camille sat with the question. She thought about the hallway at the Harrington Hotel. The word broke. The folder in the desk drawer. The kitchen table with the burn mark. Her grandfather's second porch chair. The blood pressure cuff. The Howard Journal. The settlement. Eugenia's hands. She said, clarifying. Everything became very clear. Josephine wrote that down. The piece ran the following month. The headline was, Building Eva May, How Camille Whitfield Graves Inherited a Legacy and Grew It into the Future. Her grandfather called when he read it. He said, your grandmother's name is in this article. Camille said, I know. He said, and her mother's name. She said, I know. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I am proud of you, baby girl. I have always been proud of you. But today I am particularly proud of you. She said, I know, Grandpa. I know. She held the phone against her ear and she breathed. She thought about Iva May's ledger, kept in a Bible, careful and exact. The first record of what the family was building. She thought about her own ledger, encrypted on a drive, careful and exact. Different tools. The same work. She was building the next entry in the ledger. She was building it for Eugenia. Everything she built, Eugenia would inherit, including the knowledge, especially the knowledge. On the porch in Cascade Heights on the Sunday morning in April, time moved differently. That was the thing about her grandfather's porch. It had always moved differently there. The city moved at the same pace everywhere. The city was efficient and ambitious, and always in the process of becoming the next version of itself. But the porch existed at a pace that was older than the city's pace. The pace of a man who had decided in 1979 what he was building and who had been patient about the building ever since. She had needed that pace. She needed it now. Eugenia slept on her chest. The rhythm of the baby's breathing was the most regular thing in the world. In and out, perfectly paced, unconcerned with anything except the next breath and the one after that. She matched her breathing to her daughter's. She breathed. Her grandfather said after a while, "You know what I never told you?" She said, "What?" He said, "The day you called me, the night of the gala." He paused. "I knew something was wrong before you said a word. I heard it. The quality of your voice when you asked me if everything was still in place." He stopped. She said, "What did you think?" He said, "I thought, Lord, here it is." He looked at the street. "I had been watching that marriage for 3 years. I saw what he took from you. Not the money. The room. He took up all the room and left you in the corners of it. And I knew you were too strong to stay in the corners forever." He paused. He said, "I am sorry it hurt. I am not sorry it ended." She looked at her grandfather's profile, the 72 years of him, the specific wisdom that lived in the careful way he looked at things. She said, "I am not sorry it ended either." He said, "Good." They sat. The April morning moved around them. The birds were insistent now. The lawnmower that had been a block away moved closer. A child's voice somewhere. The city going on. She thought about how many women were in this moment sitting in kitchens and parking lots and porches trying to figure out what came next. How many women were in the middle of the hardest thing they had faced and were trying to locate the version of themselves that knew how to get through it. She wanted the foundation to reach them. Not just the women at Howard and Spelman and Clark Atlanta, all of them. The women who did not have a grandfather who had started a brokerage account in 1978. The women who were starting from a different place. The women who were starting from the kind of broke that was real and not the kind that was a mistake made by a woman who did not know what she was looking at. She was going to build something that helped all of them. Not with money, necessarily. With knowledge. With the specific understanding that wealth was not luck or inheritance or the right marriage. It was knowledge applied with patience over time. It was work stored. It was interest compounding. It was one woman's decision, made in difficult circumstances, that the future deserved better. She looked down at Eugenia. Eugenia was deep in the particular sleep of someone who has been very well cared for and knows it. She was going to know everything. All of it. Every name. Every woman. Every dollar and every decision and every reason the decisions were made the way they were. She was going to know that she came from women who built things. She was going to know that she was the latest and not the last of them. She was going to know that the world would tell her sometimes that she had nothing. And she was going to know, from the deepest part of herself, that she was the interest on what they saved. That she was the result of 100 years of deliberate, patient, loving work. That she was not starting from nothing. She was starting from everything they survived to hand her. Reginald put his hand over Camille's hand on the arm of the chair. He left it there. They breathed together. The April morning kept going, because April mornings do. Because the world is remarkable in that way. Its ability to simply keep going even when what happens inside it is extraordinary. The birds kept singing. The child kept riding the bicycle around the block. The lawnmower kept its sound. The city kept being the city. And on the porch of a house in Cascade Heights that a man had bought in 1979 to build something lasting in, 2 people breathed in the April light. And between them, sleeping with complete confidence in the morning, was the 4th generation of a family that had decided, $1 at a time, one decision at a time, one woman at a time, that the future was worth building for. She called me broke. She had no idea that broke is something we have never been. My grandmother's grandmother was broke, and she put the first dollar away anyway. She kept the ledger anyway. She believed in the future anyway when the world gave her every reason not to. I am only here because she did. My daughter is only here because she did. We are not broke. We are the interest on what they saved, and the interest, compounding through 4 generations of Whitfield women, is extraordinary. Broderick accepted on a Tuesday afternoon. Not the first offer, the second amended offer, which included an increased share of marital assets, 52%, given the documentation of the LLC. Structure, its use of redirected funds from accounts she had co-signed, and the unauthorized audit that established his intent before the formal proceedings began, 52% was what the record supported, and Imani had built the record correctly. The custody arrangement remained. Primary to Camille, visitation rights for Broderick specific and enforceable. Monthly support through Eugenia's 22nd birthday. The non-disparagement agreement remained. Broader than the initial offer now. It included language about the Whitfield Trust and Eva May Holdings and the Whitfield family broadly. He signed it all. Imani called Camille at 3:15 in the afternoon. Camille was at her grandfather's house. She was in the second chair on the porch, the one that had been waiting for her for 45 years. It was late October now, and the afternoon light was doing what October light does, coming in golden and slightly sideways, the kind of light that makes everything look both more beautiful and more temporary than it actually is. Her daughter was low and heavy and entirely certain inside her. Her hands were in her lap. She was watching the street and she was breathing. She answered the phone. Imani said, "It is done." Camille closed her eyes. She held the phone against her chest for a long moment. Then she opened her eyes. Her grandfather was in the first chair, watching the street with her, knowing without being told what the call had been. She said, "It is done, Grandpa." He reached over. He put his hand over her hand. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the street and she looked at the street, and the October light moved over the neighborhood they both loved, the neighborhood he had bought into in 1979 with the specific intention of building something in it that would last. Then he said, "Good. Now let us talk about what you are going to do next." She looked at him. He said, "The foundation. You said you wanted to name it for Eva May." She said, "Yes." He said, "Tell me what it looks like." She told him. She had been thinking about it for 3 weeks. Not just thinking. She had been sketching the structure the way she sketched every financial structure. Start with the purpose. Build the mechanism around the purpose. Document everything. The Eva May Financial Literacy Foundation, a nonprofit funded through a committed $5 million grant from Eva May Holdings Incorporated. Partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities, beginning with Howard and extending to Spelman and Morehouse and the other schools in the Atlanta University Center. A curriculum focused specifically on financial architecture. Not just budgeting, not just the basic vocabulary that most financial literacy programs covered, but the deeper work. Trusts, holding structures, the legal mechanisms by which wealth is built and protected and passed forward. The specific knowledge that her grandfather had handed to her and that Eva May had started building before anyone thought to give it a name. She was going to trace that line publicly and teach it forward. Her grandfather listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother would have cried." Camille said, "I know." He said, "She would have cried, and then she would have asked you exactly how you intend to measure the outcomes so that you know the curriculum is actually working and not just sounding like it is working." Camille said, "I have thought about that too." He laughed. It was a good sound. Warm and slow and entirely himself. On the Sunday following the settlement, Reverend Hollis stood at the pulpit of New Covenant Baptist Church and made an announcement. He said that the church's community foundation partnership with Graves Capital would be restructured. He said that the church's community programs would continue to operate through a process of independent funding development, and that the Women's Circle would be taking a lead role in identifying new community partnership opportunities. He did not name Broderick. He did not have to. The congregation had been paying attention. The congregation had always been paying attention. They were the kind of people who listened carefully and understood more than they said, and who made their loyalties known not through drama but through the quiet and consistent work of who they called and who they showed up for, and whose name they said warmly and whose name they stopped saying warmly. After the service, 3 elders approached Camille as she was walking to her car. She had come alone. Gloria was in Birmingham. Dorothy was walking with Marvella. But Camille had come to the service because this was her church, and it had been her church since she was a child, and she was not going to stay away from her church because of what someone else had done. The 3 elders stopped her on the sidewalk. They said simply, "We are with you. Whatever you build, we are with you." She thanked them. She drove to her grandfather's house. She sat in the second chair. She watched the street. She breathed. My mother did not raise me to disappear inside somebody else's name. She raised me to know my own. I have always known my own. Eugenia Dorothy Whitfield Graves arrived on a Thursday morning, 6 days before her due date. She arrived with strong opinions about being born. She arrived with a voice that made clear immediately that she had inherited the specific Whitfield quality of saying exactly what she thought without waiting to be invited. She arrived with a full head of dark hair and eyes that were dark and wide, and already, within the first hour of her life, looking at the world with the focused attention of someone who had strong opinions about what she was seeing. She arrived at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital at 7:43 in the morning, and the three people in the delivery room were chosen by Camille with the same precision she applied to every significant decision. Dorothy Whitfield, who had been in delivery rooms before, and who knew exactly how to hold a person through impossible things. Gloria Whitfield, who had driven up from Birmingham the night before, when Camille called to say she thought it was time. And Niecy Marie Holloway, who stood in the delivery room in expensive sneakers, holding Camille's hand and talking her through each contraction with the warm and clinical precision of a woman trained to remain steady when everything else is moving. Niecy said, during a contraction that lasted longer than the others, I know. Breathe. Give me the breath. Camille breathed. She breathed the way her grandmother had taught her. Down to the roots. Long and intentional. She breathed through all of it. The long hours of labor that moved through the night and into the morning. She breathed when it was hard, and she breathed when it was impossible, and she breathed when the only thing left to do was breathe, because her body had taken over entirely and was doing something that it knew how to do better than her mind did. At 7:43 in the morning, Eugenia arrived. She was placed on Camille's chest. Camille held her. She did not say anything for a very long time. She looked at her daughter's face, the specific new perfection of it, the dark eyes, the small determined mouth, the expression, so immediate and complete, of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is already assessing it. She breathed. In the recovery room, when Dorothy and Gloria had stepped out and Niecy was in the corner, writing in the chart, Camille held Eugenia in the crook of her left arm, and she looked out the window at the Atlanta morning. The sun was fully up. The city was doing its day. Somewhere in the miles of it, a man who did not know yet that everything had shifted was going about his morning in whatever form that morning took for him now. She was not thinking about him. She was thinking about Eva May. She was thinking about the ledger in the Bible and the money in the shoes and the specific decision a woman had made on a sharecropper's farm in Alabama about what the future of her children was going to look like and how she was going to make it look that way with whatever she had available to her. She was thinking about her grandmother, who had taken online finance courses at 63 years old because she wanted to understand what she was protecting. She was thinking about her grandfather, who had walked into a brokerage office in downtown Atlanta in 1978 and placed his documents on the table in front of a man who had looked at him with the expression of someone deciding whether to bother. She thought, this is the inheritance. This is what we actually pass down. Not the money, the understanding of it, the patience that built it, the specific refusal across generations to let the world's opinion of what was possible for you determine what you actually built. Eugenia was going to know all of it. Camille called her mother at 2 in the morning from the hospital room. Eugenia was asleep on her chest. The monitors hummed. The room was its specific hospital quiet. She called and she did not say anything. She just held the phone against her ear, and she breathed. And on the other end of the line, Dorothy Whitfield, who was already awake, who had been already awake for 2 hours, because she had always been awake for the things that mattered in her daughter's life, even when they happened at 2 in the morning, breathed back. They breathed together for 30 seconds. Then Dorothy said quietly, I love you. Camille said, I love you, Mama. She hung up. She looked at Eugenia. She thought, you have a mother who knows her own name. You have a great-great-great-grandmother who kept money in her shoes so that one day you would not have to. You have 4 generations of women who built things in silence so that you would be born into something solid. You are going to know all of it. At 9 in the morning, Broderick came to the hospital. He was allowed. He was her father. Camille had thought about this moment over the past weeks, and she had decided that Broderick's relationship to his daughter was not a thing she was going to use as leverage or as punishment. She had made that decision cleanly, and she held it cleanly. He stood in the doorway of the room. He looked at Eugenia in the small hospital bed, where Camille had placed her briefly while she ate breakfast. He looked at the dark hair and the small hands and the perfect composed sleeping face of his daughter. He looked at Camille. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, she is beautiful. Camille said, she is. He moved carefully into the room. He was not the man from the gala, the boardroom smooth man who knew how to work a room. He was just a person, just someone who had made a significant mistake and was standing in the full awareness of what that mistake had cost, and who was looking at his daughter for the first time and understanding that some things could not be corrected, only carried. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He said, I did not know about the trust, about what you had built. Camille said, I know you did not. A pause. He said, would it have made a difference if you had told me? She considered it honestly. She sat with the question the way she sat with hard questions. She did not rush to a comfortable answer. She thought about it, the specific and real question of whether knowledge of her financial independence would have changed how he treated her, whether knowing she did not need him would have made him value her more or made him feel more threatened. She said, I do not know, but I know this. I'm glad I did not have to find out. He nodded. He stayed for 40 minutes. He held Eugenia with the specific reverence of someone holding something that matters more than anything they have ever held. He was careful and quiet and present in the way he had not been present in years. He handed her back. He left. He will be her father. He will not be her story. Camille looked at Eugenia. He loved the version of me that made him look better in rooms where he needed help. I am done being a version. I am the original. I am the only one. She held her daughter. She breathed. 6 weeks after Eugenia was born, Camille sat at a conference table she had never sat at before. She had been coming to this building for 2 years, the offices of Henderson Wallace and Associates, where her grandfather's accounts had been managed and where her own management of those accounts had been formalized. She had sat in the meeting room twice, always across from Henderson, always in the position of someone reviewing what others had prepared. Today the seat arrangements were different. Today she was at the head of the table. The boardroom of Iva May Holdings Incorporated formally convened for the first time with Camille Eugenia Whitfield Graves as the managing principal, Henderson Wallace on her right, Amani Cross on her left, 2 financial analysts from the firm, a representative from the foundation attorney's office. Eugenia was in a carrier on Camille's chest. She was 6 weeks old and had already developed the habit of sleeping soundly through any conversation that did not directly involve her. She slept now, face tucked down, breath warm against Camille's sternum. Camille looked around the table. She looked at the faces of the people she had assembled, the people who were going to help her build what came next. She looked at the room, good light, clean surfaces, the atmosphere of a space that was ready to do serious work. She had spent 6 weeks reading every document in the portfolio, not reviewing, reading. The way you read something you intend to understand completely rather than manage adequately. Every real estate investment trust position, every private equity stake, every Alabama land holding that her grandfather's grandfather had kept in a cousin's name during the Jim Crow era and that had passed through 4 generations of careful legal documentation to arrive in Iva May Holdings Incorporated at its restructuring in 2009. She knew the full picture now, not just the numbers, the story behind the numbers, the name behind every decision, the reason behind every position. She was ready. She opened the meeting. She presented 3 investment recommendations she had been developing over the past 4 weeks. She presented them with full documentation, with clear risk analysis, with the specific language of someone who had spent 5 years watching how the best financial minds in Atlanta did this work, and who had been doing it herself, in her own name, for 3 years before that. Henderson Wallace asked clear, precise questions. She answered them, directly, without hedging. The analysts reviewed the supporting documents. When it was done, Henderson looked at her and said, "These are sound recommendations." She said, "I know." They voted. The positions were approved. She moved to the second item. She said, "I want to formally present the Eva May Financial Literacy Foundation to this board for approval as a philanthropic commitment from Eva May Holdings Incorporated." She had prepared the full proposal: mission statement, partnership structure, curriculum framework, measurement methodology, because her grandfather had reminded her that her grandmother would have wanted to know exactly how the outcomes would be tracked. $5 million initial commitment from the holdings, HBCU partnerships beginning with Howard University and extending to Spelman College and Clark Atlanta University. An advisory board that would include her grandfather, Henderson Wallace, and 3 financial professionals she had identified from her own network. She presented it all. The room was quiet when she finished. Henderson said, "Your grandmother would have been proud." She said, "I know." Her grandfather's voice came through the speakerphone in the center of the table. He had declined to make the drive, which was a practical decision about his knees. But he had asked to be present by phone for this meeting, and she had said yes without hesitation. He said from the speaker, in the slow and certain voice she had been listening to her entire life, "That is correct, baby girl. That is exactly right." The room was quiet for a moment. Then they voted. The foundation was approved. I was quiet for years, not because I was weak, Because I was working. I am done being quiet. The work is finished. The results speak for themselves. 3 weeks after the board meeting, the Atlanta Business Chronicle ran a piece about the launch of the Eva Mae Financial Literacy Foundation and its partnership agreements with 3 historically black colleges and universities in the Atlanta metro area. The piece included a photograph of Camille at the conference table of Eva Mae Holdings. The headline named her by her full name, Camille Eugenia Whitfield Graves, Managing Principal. Her phone was ringing before the article was fully loaded on her screen. Gloria, Nisi, 3 people from her Howard graduating class. Marvella Hughes from the Women's Circle. Reverend Hollis. Sterling Devereaux, who said simply, "There it is." She also received, sometime in the mid-afternoon, a handwritten note on plain notepaper. Shanice Fontaine had found a mailing address somehow. The note was 4 sentences. "I am sorry for every word I said about you. I am sorry I did not know you before I let someone else describe you to me. I have received my own settlement and I am starting over. I hope your daughter grows up to be exactly you." Camille read the note twice. She put it in the folder where she kept documents she intended to keep. She thought, the world is stranger and more complicated than any single version of it. That is something Eugenia was going to need to know too. She picked up her daughter. She held her against her chest. She breathed. The story ends where it was always going to end. On a porch. Camille's grandfather's porch in Cascade Heights. It is a Sunday morning in April. Not a formal Sunday. Not a church Sunday. Just a morning that the calendar has labeled Sunday and that the neighborhood has received with the specific approval of a neighborhood that knows how to be Sunday. Birds, because it is spring. A dog 2 houses down. The sound of someone cutting grass a block away. The city bus turning its corner. Reginald Ernest Whitfield is in the first chair. He has a glass of water with lemon on the table. He is wearing the sweater his wife bought him on their last anniversary trip together, the soft gray one that Camille has always loved, because it is the color of the evening light on this street. Camille is in the second chair with Eugenia in her arms. Eugenia Dorothy Whitfield Graves is 8 weeks old. She is wearing the small white cap that Camille's grandmother had knitted for every baby born into the family for 30 years. The pattern passed down through the women like the financial architecture had been passed down, deliberately and with love. She is awake. Her dark eyes are open and she is looking at the morning with the focused attention that already seems to be her primary mode of engaging with the world. Everything appears to interest her. She has opinions about light. Camille has learned this in 8 weeks. Her daughter has opinions about light and sound and the specific texture of different fabrics and the relative merits of different holding positions. She is going to be, Camille understands with complete certainty, an extraordinary person. She has already started. The morning moves around them. Reginald looks at his great-granddaughter for a long time without speaking. Then he says, "She looks like your grandmother." Camille says, "I know, she does know. It is in the set of the eyes." The specific quality of attention. Her grandmother had looked at the world like that, like she was cataloging it, like everything she saw was being filed for future reference. They sit. The neighborhood does its Sunday sounds around them. The birds, the dog, the lawnmower somewhere, the bus. After a while, Reginald says, "Your grandmother used to say that money is just stored work." He looks at the street. He says, "The people who took our work, they thought they were taking the money. But the work stayed in us. We just had to learn how to store it again." Camille looks at her daughter. Eugenia, in the specific way of 8-week-old babies, is unconcerned with everything except the quality of the morning light, which she appears to find acceptable. Her small hands are folded against her chest. Her breathing is even and complete. She is going to know all of it, Camille says. Everything we built, every name behind it, every decision and why it was made. I am going to tell her all of it. Her grandfather nods. He says, "That is the wealth." Camille looks out at the street, her grandfather's neighborhood, her grandmother's choice, her family's long and deliberate and surviving love. She thinks about Eva Mae, who kept money in her shoes. She thinks about Earl Whitfield, who sharecropped land he did not own and came home to a woman who kept a ledger and a Bible. She thinks about Reginald, who walked into a brokerage office in downtown Atlanta in 1978 and placed his documents on the table. She thinks about her grandmother, who took finance courses at 63 years old because she wanted to understand what they had built. She thinks about Dorothy, who almost left a marriage and instead rebuilt herself inside it, and who has been the first face and the first voice and the first warmth in every hard moment of Camille's life. She thinks about Gloria, who had a legal document case ready for 3 years and picked up the phone on the first ring. She thinks about Nisi, who drove 4 hours with a blood pressure cuff and oxtail. She thinks about Marvella and Claudette, and the women who came with food and presents, and the understanding that needed no language. She thinks about the second chair on this porch, which has been waiting for her since before she was born. She thinks about everything she has built and everything she has survived, and the specific truth that those two things are not separate. You do not build something real without surviving something real first. The building and the surviving are the same act. She breathes. For the first time in more than a year, she breathes without managing what comes next. She does not have to manage. She has done the work. The structure is built. The documentation is complete. The foundation is funded. The accounts are growing. Her daughter is in her arms. Her grandfather is in the first chair. The morning is doing its morning things. She does not have to manage any of it. She just breathes. She called me broke. She had no idea that broke is something we have never been. My grandmother's grandmother was broke. She lived on a sharecropper's farm in Alabama, and she kept money in her shoes and a ledger in her Bible because there was no institution that would protect what she had. And she put the first dollar away anyway. She kept the first ledger anyway. She dreamed the dream for her children anyway, without knowing whether the world would let them live it. I am only here because she did. My daughter is only here because she did. We are not broke. We are the interest on what they saved. Eugenia closes her eyes. She has decided that the morning light, while acceptable, is perhaps a little bright for sleeping, and she has made the practical decision to close her eyes against it. She makes a small sound, a satisfied sound, the sound of someone who has assessed her situation and found it sufficient. Camille holds her closer. Her grandfather watches the street. The city moves around them, the birds and the dog and the lawnmower and the bus. A child on a bicycle. Someone playing music from an open window, something slow and warm and Sunday. Reginald reaches over. He pats Camille's hand once. He says, without looking away from the street your grandmother would have loved to see this morning. Camille says, I know. He says, she sees it anyway. They sit, they breathe. The April morning opens around them and keeps going, as mornings do, into everything that comes next. Into a future that is wider and more real and more entirely hers than any room she was ever decorative in. Into the story of a woman who was quiet for 5 years because she was building something. Who paid attention when the person beside her had stopped paying attention to her? Who did not perform strength but generated it from the ground up, from the first dollar Eva May put in her shoe to the $514 million sitting in the accounts of a holding company named after her. Eugenia Dorothy Whitfield Graves does not know yet what she is heir to. She will. Camille is going to tell her all of it. Every name, every decision, every dollar. Every woman who sat on a porch or stood at a kitchen counter or kept a ledger and a Bible so that this morning could exist. The city moves. Spring moves. Eugenia sleeps in her mother's arms on the porch of the house her great-great-great-grandfather built. And Camille Eugenia Whitfield Graves breathes. Just breathes. In the home that has always been waiting for her. In the chair that was always hers. In the life that was always hers to live. There are nights you remember not for what happened in them, but for what you did not yet know was coming. The night before the gala, Camille had made dinner for two. It was a Tuesday evening in October. She made the salmon Broderick liked, with the lemon dill sauce, and roasted asparagus, and a wild rice dish she had learned from a cooking class she had attended alone 3 years ago, because Broderick had canceled at the last minute. She set the table with the good plates. She lit the candle that lived in the center of the table. She made everything the way she had made it hundreds of times. She ate with her husband. He talked about the gala, the guest list, the projections for the event's impact on the Q4 investor relations picture. He was good at this kind of conversation, the specific and detailed vocabulary of his professional world. She listened. She asked the right questions. She contributed twice, something that was more than a question, an observation about one of the investors that Broderick incorporated into his thinking without noting that he had incorporated it. She had been doing that for 5 years, contributing things without being credited for contributing them. She had long since stopped expecting credit. She had stopped expecting it before she understood, fully, what the pattern meant. After dinner, he went to his office. She cleaned up. She stood at the kitchen sink with her hands in warm, soapy water, and she looked out the window at the backyard. The landscaping was lit from below by the specific lighting system that made everything look like a magazine spread. Beautiful and deliberate, and entirely without anything spontaneous or personal in it. She rinsed the last pan. She dried her hands. She stood at the window for a moment longer. The baby moved. A small but definite shift, the kind that meant a change in position, something settling. She put her hand on her stomach. She said quietly, "We are all right, baby girl." She had not known, standing at that window, How fully that sentence was both true and not yet true. She was all right. She would be all right. But first she would have to walk through everything that was coming, and she did not yet know it was coming. The next evening, she stood in the hallway of the Harrington Hotel, and she heard a word that changed the shape of her life. And she was in fact all right. Not because she was strong enough to absorb anything. Not because she was built for endurance in a way that required her to accept any treatment. Because she had built something, quietly and patiently, that made her the person who got to decide what came next. She had always been all right. She had just needed one word to make it visible. Gloria Whitfield had practiced family law for 11 years. She had handled divorces that were simple and divorces that were nightmares. She had handled custody situations that broke her heart and financial disputes that required the full force of her professional expertise. She was known in Birmingham, and increasingly in Atlanta, as someone who was technically excellent and also genuinely committed to the people she represented. She was committed to them because she understood what was at stake. Not just the assets, the sense of self, the understanding of your own worth that can get eroded, in a difficult marriage, by 1,000 small moments of being told your perspective does not count. She had seen in 11 years of practice what that erosion did to people, how it made them doubt their own perception of things, how it made them need the validation of a legal system to confirm what they already knew. She had been watching her sister's marriage with professional attention for 3 years. She had not said anything because Camille had not asked. She had respected that. She believed fiercely in the autonomy of the person. She did not push doors open. She waited. But she had been ready. The moment the text arrived at 1 in the morning, she was ready. She had driven 3 hours in the dark of a Tuesday morning, and she had arrived at her mother's house with the document case she had been keeping in the trunk of her car, literally in the trunk of her car, for approximately 8 months, because she had wanted to be ready if the call came. The call came. She was ready. What she found when she sat down with Camille at that kitchen table was something she had suspected but not known. She had suspected that Camille's financial position was stronger than Broderick knew. She had not known the specific shape of the strength. When Camille walked her through the trust structure and the Eva May Holdings framework and the growth from 92 million to 514 million, Gloria had felt something that she would later describe to her husband, privately, as professional joy. Not joy at her sister's pain, joy at the specific satisfaction of watching someone who has been underestimated reveal the full scope of what they actually are. Broderick had made a specific and serious mistake. He had assessed his wife based on what he was willing to see. He had built his assumptions about her financial position on the surface presentation of a family he had decided early was not worth his sustained attention. He had been wrong. He had been so wrong that the wrongness was going to take several court filings and a settlement agreement to fully establish. Gloria had been delighted to help establish it. She called Amani Cross at 9:15 that morning with the words that she knew would get Amani's full attention immediately. She said, "I have a situation that is going to be one of the most satisfying cases of your career." Amani had been quiet for 3 seconds. Then she had said, "Tell me everything." Gloria had told her everything. And Amani Cross had opened her legal pad, because 20 years of practice had taught her to always have a legal pad open, and she had begun writing the first notes of what was going to become the most elegantly constructed divorce settlement she had assembled in recent memory. Warren Darnell Price was not a man who made decisions quickly. He was deliberate. He was thorough. He looked at all the angles before he moved. He had built 15 years of a professional relationship with Broderick Kingston Graves on the foundation of being thorough before he moved. He was not the exciting one in the room. He was the one who made sure that the exciting ideas translated into solid financial structure. He had been doing that for 15 years. He had also, for 3 years, been watching a situation develop that was not compatible with the integrity he believed he had been building his professional reputation on. He had told himself it was not his business. He sat in his car in the parking structure beneath the Graves Capital offices on the morning after the gala, and he had the specific interior conversation with himself that he had been deferring for 3 years. He had it clearly. He did not flinch from it. He looked at each decision he had made and what each decision had enabled and what the total of those decisions amounted to. He had known what was happening. He had chosen to manage it rather than challenge it. He had made himself comfortable with a level of complicity that he was no longer comfortable with. He called his wife. He said the things he needed to say. His wife said, "Warren, you know what you need to do?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Do you need me to tell you it is going to be okay?" He said, "No, I need to do the thing." She said, "Then go do it." He called the attorney that afternoon. It took 11 minutes to explain the situation. The attorney asked several clarifying questions. The attorney said that Warren had an obligation to disclose information relevant to legal proceedings that he had direct knowledge of, and that he should prepare a comprehensive statement of what he knew, when he knew it, and what specific events and documents he could speak to from direct personal knowledge. Warren prepared the statement over 4 days. He was thorough. He documented everything he had personal knowledge of. He did not speculate beyond what he knew directly. He was precise. He filed the disclosure with his attorney. His attorney contacted Amani Cross within 24 hours. Warren sat in his car after that call, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not relief exactly, something sturdier than relief. The specific feeling of being in alignment with the person he had decided to be when he decided to do this work. He had spent 3 years not in alignment. He was in alignment now. He did not know what it was going to cost him professionally. He understood that there would be costs. He had made peace with that the night he told his wife he was going to do the right thing. He had made peace with it completely, and in the end, it cost him less than he feared, because the serious people in Broderick's professional circle had been watching. And the serious people understood the difference between loyalty to a person and loyalty to the work. Warren had chosen the work. That was a choice the serious people respected. He kept his career. He rebuilt his integrity. Both things mattered. The Sunday morning after the settlement was finalized, Camille walked into New Covenant Baptist Church with her mother. She had been away from the church for 5 weeks. She had not intended that absence as a statement. She had simply been doing other things, being in other places, getting through the immediate and necessary work of navigating her life's restructuring. But she had felt the absence. She had felt it the way you feel the absence of something that has been part of your rhythm for so long that you breathe differently without it. She dressed carefully that morning. Not the gala dresses of Broderick's world. Her own clothes, the ones she had chosen for herself. A deep green dress that made her feel like herself. Her grandmother's earrings, the small gold ones she had kept since her grandmother passed them to her in their last good visit before the diagnosis. She walked into the church with her mother. The choir was already warming up. She could hear it before she reached the sanctuary. The specific layered sound of a choir finding its collective voice, individual voices testing and adjusting, and eventually aligning into something larger than any one of them could produce alone. She had loved that sound since she was a child. She loved it now. She found a seat in the middle of the sanctuary. Not the front, not the back, the middle. The seat of a person who was present and not announcing anything. The service began. She breathed through the music. She breathed through the prayers. She breathed through the sermon, which was about rebuilding, about the specific courage required to return to something that has been disrupted and to build it again on a sounder foundation. She understood that sermon more than she had ever understood anything preached in this room. After the service, she stood in the light of the October sun in front of the church, and she spoke with the people who came to speak with her. Some of them she had known for 30 years. Some of them she had known only through Broderick's events. Some of them she was meeting, in a real sense, for the first time, because the previous meetings had been as Broderick's wife rather than as herself. She was herself today. She spoke, she listened, she was present. Marvella Hughes came to stand beside her at one point and just stood there, not saying anything, just present, while Camille spoke with a woman she had known since childhood, just being there. The way the women's circle was. Camille looked at Marvella at one point in a moment between conversations. She said, "I am glad to be back." Marvella said, "We are glad to have you back. We always knew this was yours." Camille said, "I know." She had always known that too. Additional scene, the first monthly statement. 3 months after the settlement, the first monthly statement arrived from the Iva May Financial Literacy Foundation. Enrollment numbers from the HBCU partnerships. Howard University had 11 students in the pilot curriculum. Spelman had 7. Clark Atlanta had 9. 27 young women sitting in classrooms learning about trusts and holding structures and the legal mechanisms of protecting what you build. Camille read the report at her grandfather's kitchen table. He read it over her shoulder. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said 27. She said just the first quarter. He said 27 young women who are going to know things my grandfather did not know. Things my father did not know. Things I had to figure out from scratch, she said. And their daughters will know them from the beginning. He put his hand on her shoulder. He said Eva May would have been proud. Camille said, "I know." She thought about Eva May's ledger, kept in a Bible, the first record of the work. She thought about her own ledger, encrypted and documented. 47 quarterly entries. $514 million. She thought about the foundation's record, 27 names in the first cohort. Different ledgers. The same work. The work of deciding that the people who came after you were going to have what you did not have. The work of building toward a future you could not see but that you believed in completely because the alternative was not building toward it. She believed in it. She had always believed in it. She was building toward it. One cohort at a time, one young woman at a time, $1 and one decision, and one generation at a time. The way Eva May started, the way it would keep going. In the first week after the gala, there were calls Camille did not make. She did not call the women from Broderick's professional circle who had been friendly to her over 5 years. The wives of board members. The partners at associated firms who had sent congratulations when the pregnancy was announced. She did not call them because she understood that their first loyalty was to the network that had made them and that she was not yet certain which direction they would turn. She did not call the women from New Covenant Baptist immediately, though she knew they would come when she needed them and she knew Marvella had already heard something from Patricia. She did not call her old mentor from Howard, the finance professor who had told her in her junior year that she had the specific combination of analytical precision and relational intelligence that produced the best financial managers. She did not call him because she was not ready for his version of wisdom yet. She was in the middle of the work, and she needed to stay in the middle of the work, without the perspective of someone who was outside it. She did not call Broderick. This was the most significant not calling of all. She had spent 5 years reflexively reaching for the phone to manage his perception of things, to smooth situations, to be the person who checked in and made sure he was all right and communicated her availability. She had been doing this since the first year of the marriage when she had understood, without being told, that Broderick needed active management of his emotional environment in order to function at his best. She had provided that management. She had provided it consistently and without keeping score and without asking for reciprocity. Now she sat with the phone in her hand and she did not call him, and she did not feel the pull to call him, and the absence of that pull told her something important. It told her that the part of her that had always known this marriage was not right was now fully in charge of the decision-making. The part that had been managing and accommodating and excusing had finally completely yielded. She was done managing his emotional environment. She had her own environment to manage. She was going to manage it the way she managed the portfolio, with full attention and appropriate documentation and clear-eyed assessment of what was actually there and what it was worth. She put the phone down. She breathed. She was ready. The first 3 months of Eugenia's life were an education in the specific nature of love that does not require anything in return. Camille had known she was capable of loving her daughter. She had loved her before she was born. She had loved her as an idea, a presence, a weight and movement inside her body, a name she had chosen before she could see the face the name would belong to. She had not known until she held Eugenia in her arms in a hospital room in Atlanta at 7:43 in the morning what love felt like at full capacity. It felt like everything else became small, not unimportant, small. The dimensions of everything else, the divorce, the money, the settlement, even the foundation and the work and the future she was building, all of it became proportionate, not diminished, just proportionate. In relation to Eugenia, everything else was the right size. She discovered this in the first weeks, and she held the discovery carefully. She did not tell too many people about it because she did not have words for it yet, and also because some things are for keeping inside until they solidify into something you can actually say. What solidified was this. She had spent 5 years trying to make herself the right size for a man who could not see her. She had spent 5 years managing her own dimensions to fit into a space that was always slightly too small. She was done being the right size for anyone. She was Eugenia's mother, and she was going to be the full size of that every day of Eugenia's life. She was Camille Eugenia Whitfield Graves, and she was going to be the full size of that in every room she entered from here forward. She was the great-great-great-granddaughter of Eva May, and she was going to be the full size of that inheritance in everything she built. She was exactly large enough. She had always been exactly large enough. She picked up her daughter. She held her against her chest. She breathed. In the afternoon light of the house she had moved into, a townhouse in the same East Atlanta neighborhood where her mother lived, 3 blocks from Dorothy's house, close enough to walk to and far enough to be her own, she sat in the rocking chair she had ordered and waited for, and assembled herself in the guest room that was now Eugenia's room. The room was sage green, the exact shade Nisi had painted the room in Charlotte that Eugenia had not yet visited but that was waiting for her. She rocked. Eugenia slept. The afternoon moved through the window. Camille thought about nothing. She breathed. She was home.